growth boundary as an expansion area to accommodate housing needs. So as part of that process, going through the state process to do that expansion, there's a requirement that we go through and look at housing efficiency measures to use our land wisely within the city in ways that minimize the need for expansion of the urban growth boundary. Even with those elements, which are the cottage cluster, the planned unit development updates, the commercial updates in our code, there's still going to be that need, but it does end up using the land as wisely as we can and looking at the diversification of housing product within the city. As I mentioned, the two zones that we're going to be focusing on for residential are the R1 low-density residential and medium-density residential R15. Those are the applicable zones for the cottage cluster and the planned unit development code updates. The planned unit development code is a code that already exists, and so that's an update. The cottage cluster is essentially, it's a brand new code element, but thematically these all have to marry together so that when you go to the R1 zone code section and the R15 code section, you see references to the other sections of the code. So that I talked about the commercial, highway commercial as being the third element here. And there's a number of elements that are in play here for housing efficiency measures. They need to be consistent with state housing laws and clear and objective standards. There'll be more information that'll be provided by Jessica and by Kelly on that, so I won't go into that detail. And so really the overall purpose here is to, like I said, is to use land wisely to limit the need to expand the urban growth boundary, to provide housing opportunities based on needs and identified in the housing needs analysis and based on household incomes, which is really important, and to promote housing affordability. Part of that emphasis is we really are looking at trying to provide housing for those that really would desire housing in this community. And one recent example of seeing that need was in a recent meeting that we had on the 16th of November with major employers within Canby who all reflected that there'd be, if there was a greater variety of housing product types, their employees who do not live in the city would most likely live in the city. We felt that was a pretty powerful statement on their part. That was not something that we queued up necessarily. We met with them to be addressing their thoughts on industrial primarily in terms of like where the city is going and the value of those jobs that would be created, and they clearly offered that information as something for us to consider in this process. So I think that is a big statement. There are executives they've mentioned that clearly can afford the more expensive homes, but many of the workers that these large industries, and they're pretty representative, there were 6 of them in the Canby. I can go into detail on those if you'd like, but those 6 representative industries all said that there's a lack of housing opportunity and the cost issue is preventing their employees from living here. So housing variety, again, is really critical as we're seeing younger adults and families. The need for having that variety is really critical in Canby. I think one of those elements that the comprehensive plan is really trying to address is by providing that diversified housing product, we can maintain the very varied age spread across Canby, which is quite varied now. But if there's nothing done to look at that cost issue, that will not be varied in the future. In 20 years, it will look quite a bit different and will be probably a much older community than one that is here today. And we believe that would impact school enrollment over the next 20 years. So just a little bit more, and this is going to be on December 11th. You're going to get the draft housing needs analysis. I know you've been waiting patiently for that, but just some highlights for that. And some of this is a repeat, but roughly 2,300 new additional housing units over the next 20 years. 6,000 people roughly is projected over the next 20 years based on the Portland State University population projections. One of the items that we thought was quite important were the 2 highlighted sections about what we're kind of targeting with our housing efficiency measures, which we think really of those roughly 2,300 residents, 2,300 new dwelling units. We're seeing 582 single-family homes with smaller lot sizes being in demand, and 412 townhomes and plexes that are part of that mix as well. Those would be addressed, we think, with the code changes that we're now proposing that are efficiency measures, the cottage cluster in particular for the smaller lots, and for the townhomes and plexes, the plan unit development modifications that we're making would make that more allowable and permissible as a product diversification in that PUD process. So those are two items there that are part of that mix that we'll be talking about tonight. And with that, I think I'll turn this over next to Jessica, and she'll have a few things on clear and objective standards, and we're going to have Kelly Reed speak to some, with DLCD, some clear and objective standard items, and then Jessica will take us back through the rest of the slides. I want this to be interactive. If you have questions as we go, please feel free to ask those. And also, the one thing I want you to be clear on is that there will be obviously other opportunities to talk about these. A lot of information to digest tonight, and I just want you to know that we're going to be coming back with, we're hoping to get substantive comments from you, and then we'll come back and have a further discussion about this, including graphical examples of, once we go through this, you're going to see more graphical examples when we come back on February 12th that will kind of give you more of the detail visuals of what this would look like.
And just one small point, Dan, Commissioner Ewert just joined us, so if you do want to readdress the consent item, we can do that if you want, or still punt it to the next one.
Why don't we, could we maybe go through, since we're like right in the middle of this, and then at the end, before my planning director updates, we'll have Commissioner Ewert join, and then we can get those minutes.
Sounds good.
Completed. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Jessica to talk briefly, and then she'll be back on and after Kelly Reed speaks.
Thanks, Don. Excuse me. So get these slides advanced. Oh, went too far.
It's old school here.
Sorry. All right, one click. Okay, so just wanting to provide a quick overview of the needed housing policy and how that is really fundamentally what we're looking at addressing with these code updates. So high level look here, there is this need for housing affordability at all levels. I think we've all experienced that. Obviously, as Don mentioned, it has been something that's been demonstrated through your draft housing assessment. But generally speaking, it is a widespread issue that many communities are facing. There is a desire to look at opportunities for different housing types and how those can be provided for or permitted in more than one zoning district. So that's a particular focus in these updates, and you'll see it as we go through the slides a little bit later, but finding ways in which we allow housing types in multiple areas and through multiple methods. We are looking at how our code updates meet the clear and objective standards. These are applicable to housing, and in particular to those needed housing types that were mentioned before. And then finally, we are looking at ways in which we can cater the process by which these projects are reviewed in a way that is consistent with state law, but also provides the right level of review for the City of Canby. With that, I'm going to ask Kelly Reed to join and talk about clear and objective standards in a more detailed way. Kelly?
Hi, everyone. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Great. I'm Kelly Reed, your regional representative with DLCD. That's the Department of Land Conservation and Development. Thanks so much for having me. I'm happy to be with you, even though it's over Zoom. Don asked me to speak briefly about the clear and objective statute, ORS 197307. So first, I'm going to give you like 45 seconds of context and history, and then I'll tell you a few important things to know, like as you're talking about some code changes that you might make for these efficiency measures. So first of all, this statute, needed housing statute, has been in place for decades, but only recently was changed to encompass all housing and basically all land. So previously it was limited to needed housing on buildable land, but in 2017 that was changed to, all needed housing was kind of redefined as all housing is needed housing, and then the buildable land part was taken out, and now it's even land that maybe has overlays, slopes, natural resources on it. This statute now applies, and so since then there have been several cases before the Land Use Board of Appeals where there's been some interpretation, and there have been several cities that have seen their decisions get remanded back to them because they were applying standards to housing that LUBA deemed to be not clear and objective. So we're all kind of navigating the new statute, and DLCD's role is really, we provide grants to local governments so they can make code updates to make their codes, make their standards for housing to be clear and objective and take out that discretionary language. And then DLCD's also been involved in, because there have been enforcement orders or petitions to DLCD to enforce the statute against some cities. And so sometimes we get petitions from members of the public. So that's kind of how DLCD's been kind of wrapped into this. But I will also say that the reason for the statute is right that it's supposed to guard against cities blocking the development of housing for like aesthetic purposes, or because folks they say that it's not compatible with the neighborhood, which as has happened a lot more in the past and has led to a lot of segregation and lack of affordable housing. And it's happened nationwide, not just in Oregon, but Oregon's been kind of guarding against that with this statute for many years. So with that said, I want to just make sure that everyone's aware that the statute requires that for housing, this doesn't apply to commercial uses or industrial uses, but for residential uses, the standards in your code, the design standards, have to be clear and objective, as well as conditions, so conditions of approval, and procedures. So it applies to standards, conditions, and procedures. The second part of that statute is that your standards, a city's or county's standards, may not have the effect of discouraging needed housing through unreasonable cost or delay. So the key words, unreasonable cost or delay. There hasn't been a whole lot of case law on what that means exactly, and it's not defined. But it's helpful to maybe keep that in mind when you're thinking about what standards apply to development of cottage clusters, for example. Like if you wanted to require 5 parking spaces per unit, as an example, as kind of an outrageous example, that would probably be litigated as being unreasonable cost, right? But where that line is, for any given type of standard, isn't defined, right? The other thing that's very important to know is that cities are allowed to have kind of 2 approval paths for housing. You have to have a clear and objective path, but you can also have an alternative path that is discretionary. And so an applicant or a developer then gets to choose, do they want to go through the clear and objective path and use the standards that are numerical and measurable and very clear, or do they want to go through the discretionary path that maybe goes to you, the Planning Commission, where you apply discretionary criteria and you can kind of use your own kind of opinions to make your decisions about whether their proposal is meets the standards. That's kind of what when you talk about your planned unit development, your PUD, that would be that optional discretionary path that an applicant can choose to take. So Dawn, I'm going to end there and then just ask you if there's anything else you wanted me to speak to.
Kelly, thank you. I think that's great. We'll continue, and there may very well be some questions that come back to you. So with that, Jessica, please.
There we go. Thanks again, Kelly. Okay, so which button do I push? Soft touch. All right. A little technical difficulty. Okay, so as we discussed at the beginning of this presentation, we are looking at updates to several sections of the existing code. We're going to start with the R1 and low density residential zone, and dovetailing off of the comments that Kelly provided, we are proposing some use updates to the R1 district. So first and foremost, we are adding code language that would allow for cottage clusters. Again, that's a new code and a new type of housing that is not covered by Canby's code currently. So that is an entirely new use that's listed for R1. And the other update we are proposing here is to modify townhomes so that they are permitted as an outright permitted use in the R1 district rather than permitted through a PUD only. And that ties back to the comments Kelly made really clear a moment ago, which I really appreciate that segue, where we have to, if we are providing a discretionary path, we must also provide a clear and objective path. Or I guess I should say we must provide that clear and objective path and then can voluntarily have that discretionary. So this is us correcting that kind of backwards implementation of townhomes in R1. I'm going to have trouble with this all day.
Yeah, that's good.
Thank you. Coupled with the uses that we're proposing to add to R1 are, of course, changes to the development standard portion of that code section so that we can marry up those uses with design standards that are clear and objective. First and foremost, we're adding a notation that there is specific standards for cottage cluster under a different code section. So instead of utilizing codes that are in the R1 section of the code, we're pointing you to a new code section, which I think we title 1638 or something along those lines. So it's basically just punting you to that new code section rather than going through R1. Okay, thank you. We are proposing to add a maximum density in the R1 zone. This is new to the code, but that 6 units per acre generally ties back with what you would get, the density yield you would get from imposing that standard minimum lot size of 7,000 square feet, which is currently under the R1 zone. But that sets that maximum target to, again, provide some balance with what you yield in the R1 district. And that is for the base zone, not specifically for PUD. In addition to that change, we are looking at and proposing some updates to the townhouse standards to again be in line with allowing them outright in the zone, but also putting some limits on what and how those develop in that scenario. So in the instance where those townhomes are in the base zone and not in a PUD, we're proposing 3,000 square foot minimum lots, or yes, minimum lot size, excuse me. And in the in a PUD under the R1 zone, they would have a minimum lot size of 1,800 square feet. Oops. We're also putting a minimum lot width of 20 feet for all townhouse lots. In the instance where you have townhomes in the R1 district and not in a PUD, we are proposing that you have a maximum of 3 consecutive townhomes in a row before you have to have a break in the structure. And that where you have a grouping of 3 townhomes next to another grouping of townhomes, that there be a minimum 20-foot separation between the groups. Again, that's in the base zone scenario. If you have a PUD in the R1, you get a little more density out of that, and so or a little more compact development. And in that scenario, you'd have 6 townhomes per group, with a minimum distance of 10 feet between each adjoining or adjacent group. And then the final adjustment under R1 is to increase impervious surface maximums to 70% of the lot area. This is in line with what we have in the R15 district, and really it's just providing that opportunity to, look at and recognize that lot sizes may fluctuate a little bit, and gives you more variety and flexibility in building out that lot to accommodate the housing type.
May I ask a question?
Of course.
So something I don't understand about these proposals is when we're talking about setting a minimum lot size at 1,800 per square feet, that would allow for 24 units per acre. And when we're talking about 6 consecutive townhouses per group, I mean, that's basically what would elsewise be qualified as this maximum density of 6 units per acre. So why are we looking at changing the base R1 code to allow such high density if we're talking about cottage clusters being their own thing separate from that? That's an alternative path. To me, this seems like an incredible increase in density in R1, and I don't fully understand why it's that.
Sure. So it's a great question. First and foremost, these development standards are not mutually exclusive. Like, you don't just get to apply one. You still have to address the maximum density. The 1,800 square foot lot size would be in a PUD setting, and there would be some expectation that you'd end up with, groupings of the units here. And we'll get into how we look at density for PUDs later, but there is still that maximum control for density, and you do have to demonstrate that. What this does is gives you the ability to have a variety in housing in that zone where it otherwise wouldn't be possible with that minimum lot size of 7,000 square feet. You don't get a townhouse on a 7,000 square foot lot.
Sure.
And so by keeping the density but allowing for a variety, it gives you the ability to do the townhouse without exceeding that density.
Commissioner Driscoll, just to add to that, I think will be helpful as we get into more the next work session and get more graphical on these concept layouts, and we would like your input tonight for questions. Just wanted to repeat what Jessica just said. So there could be a combination of different unit styles, all within 6 dwelling units an acre, which is basically what's allowed now, 6 dwelling units an acre, but you would allow the lot sizes to vary. You would still have a maximum of 6 dwelling units an acre, but you could have a mix of different product types within that. So we're not saying that the density is increasing beyond what it currently is. We're saying that it's the mix of types of housing. You could have townhouses and single-family detached houses together, not exceeding 6 dwelling units an acre. I know it's a little hard to wrap maybe around this concept because I think normally in a setting you'd say, well, if you can allow for the smaller townhomes on smaller lots, doesn't that increase the density? It does not. There'd still be a maximum.
Yeah, that's why it seems confusing, because I understand the concept of us wanting to be able to have different housing types, different unit types in one singular area. But when we're talking about allowing a maximum of 6 consecutive townhouses, which would be everything allowed on 1 acre, that's where it doesn't make a lot of sense.
Yeah, and I think the one other point I would make is that particular instance where 6 on 1 acre, that would be using the PUD density provision, which isn't the same as the base zone, right? So that is very deliberately under the PUD, whereas the reverse is at 3,000 square foot minimum lot size, or for townhomes on the base zone, where you would see, I think, quick math doesn't, you'd have to work it out. But ultimately, you're looking at those targets, and you have to provide the design allowances to let that unit style be developed. It wouldn't develop in a scenario where you have a minimum lot size of 7,000 square feet. But the way we protect the intention of that zone and the density is to keep that density maximum there. And that's why we're proposing it in concert with the townhouse changes.
Yeah, like I said, I'm still personally having a difficult time understanding why the minimum lot of 3,000 square feet that allows for 14 units per acre would not be sufficient for still mixing the different types of units together that we're aiming for. And I guess I don't also fully understand what the distinction of PUD versus uses, the cottage clusters that we're looking to add, how PUD compares to what we have now.
And I think that
And-
there's a big ramp up here, to be honest. And I was a little struggling, to be honest with you, with the PowerPoint. And what do we start with first?
Yes.
Should we start with the cottage development and the PUD and then work our way back to the base zone? They do need to integrate together, and I think it is the right way to do it, to talk about the base zone first, but I think it's a little complicated. But I think you'll see the tie-in as we get further into the presentation, when the cottage development and the PUD starts to come into play here, and it's like, oh, that makes sense. It ties back to R1 and R15.
Yeah.
So those zones have to be the driver. I think the gist of this whole thing is, the density would remain the same. I know it's a little hard to understand, like, well, it's really more about a mixing of product type than it is about increasing density. But currently, some of these things are not permitted outright. And again, this all goes back to the housing needs analysis and those targets that were highlighted before in the presentation about trying to provide that greater mix. Exclusionary zoning, where you have detached large lots with large houses on them, has not been successful in creating any affordability in Canby.
Sure.
I mean, so this is where we're at in this situation. And so to address those needs, these are 3 housing efficiency measures, again, that we think are important as to provide that opportunity, and also needed to actually go through the urban growth boundary process, which we know we need to do for 20 years of growth. So, but we want your commentary, and if you feel like those, we are totally open to discussion about what those square footages should be, as long as they don't derail the later discussion regarding cottage developments and planned unit developments. We're totally open to some of this discussion.
Oh, yeah, and
So
we can wait
Yeah.
and go through stuff.
Okay.
At this point, the thing that I don't have my head fully wrapped around.
No, it's
The PUD role in
it
all
is
this.
a jump.
Base makes sense.
It
to be
is a
building
jump.
on, and to have the cottage option,
And
but the PUD.
And I think it is a jump, and I do think that, like, the graphics that we'll have in the next round, I mean, part of this was trying to introduce the topical issues to you all, and then from there, try to, like, okay, what does that look like graphically that would represent some of these things that you're legitimately struggling with, because it is not your normal formulaic, like, this is your minimum lot, and therefore you're automatically going to multiply it out across the entire site. It works differently, that we're trying to achieve several purposes with the base zone.
Yeah.
So.
Okay, thank you.
Did you want to go to one?
I think, yes, I'm done with R1, unless there are other questions. Okay. So the next section we're covering here is the R15. First thing to note here, again, we're talking about uses first, and then we'll dive into development standards that we're proposing amendments to. One thing about Canby's code is it actually makes reference to the R1 permitted uses in the R15. So you'll notice that we don't propose cottage clusters explicitly here as a permitted outright, because they are permitted outright in R1. So just clarification there, they would be allowed in R15. We are proposing that in the R15 district, that the maximum townhouse grouping transition or change from the current 3 consecutive unit max to 6, and that 4plexes, which are currently identified as conditional, be permitted outright.
And one thing I did want to mention in all these scenarios is there's options to just your traditional R1 and your traditional R15 developments. These are alternative scenarios that we're presenting tonight. So we're not precluding, nor are we saying you shall do what we're discussing tonight. I think that's a really important element here. So yes, traditional single-family home development will continue to happen. This is intended to create some incentives to do something different to create that product. We know, for example, in the cottage developments, that there are interests by some developers to do that kind of product. That matches up, we think, pretty well with the way the draft, when we get to that tonight, the draft ordinance is identified. And so we've looked at other things where we're trying to incentivize that, but I want to make that clear that we are not changing the game rules here. You can clearly go back to do your traditional developments that you now see in Canby, all over Canby, in R1 and R15. That is not being precluded. So I don't know if we clarified that at the beginning, but I just want to make that clear.
Yeah, that's a good clarification. The idea here is just to remove barriers to these particular housing types and to provide that opportunity should the circumstances arise where it makes sense for that development pattern to occur. With the fourplexes in the R15 district, this is another example of us looking at and providing a clear and objective path for that housing type in a zone where PUD allows that use. So right now, the PUD provisions in R15 say you can have a fourplex in a PUD, but we did not have them have a clear and objective path for those particular housing types. So this modification from conditional use to permitted use in the zone would address that issue and provide a clear and objective pathway. As far as development standards are concerned, these are going to look very similar to what we talked about in the.
Hello.
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 Go ahead, Commissioner Ewert.
Thank you. Please forgive me. I'm doing this off of an iPad and a tent. So I guess what my quick question to you folks is, if the cottage clusters are allowed in the 1.5 medium density residential zone, why are we turning our R1 upside down to expand it to include these? Why? I don't understand quite why we would go to that effort to do that. Good. So that's just a question I just throw out there.
Commissioner Ewert, I think when we're going to be discussing the plan unit development projects, the code tonight as well. And I think part of that is, again, there is going to be a need to reference at a minimum what's allowed in a PUD that we're modifying, that we're suggesting. And the one piece that I think is discretionary to some degree is, should we just leave the standards the way they are in the R1 and R15 for other townhomes in the current code versus modifying those. So that would be part of the discussion tonight. I think we felt like because the plan unit development is going to be something we're discussing tonight and it has to be in the R1 and R15 designations, we have to identify that in those base zones that we included them. And Jessica, you may have other comments.
No, I think that covers it. I think the idea here is to marry up what we're allowing in PUDs to be also shown under the base zone in a clear and objective way to comply with the state law and to provide that opportunity for optionality in housing types. Agreed, the townhomes are different than the cottage cluster concept, but again, in the case of the townhomes and the fourplexes, we're looking at ways in which we can establish that clear and objective pathway for approval for that housing product type, and also to, in the instance of PDs, perhaps provide some incentivization to kind of promote that optionality to diversify the housing products.
Did that answer your
All right,
question? Yeah.
No, well, not really. I am not convinced that we need to change our R1 zoning to include the cottage cluster housing type. I think we've got it in the 1.5, and I'm not jumping up and down to add that to what we do in R1. So I'm just going to throw that out there.
And I would just like us, if hopefully your connection stays on so we can get to the PUD process. But I mean, part of that is in the PUD now, it's largely single-family detached houses. And I think part of that is we're trying to create the opportunity for attached product that would go into PUDs as well. And maybe we're just, if that's the recommendation of the Planning Commission, we just leave what's in the code now for alternatives to single-family homes on townhomes in the current code. And we can do that if that is the recommendation of the Planning Commission.
Okay, well, and the other thing that I have a little bit of a problem with is that it seems to be presenting here tonight, what's being presented is saying that to meet the state requirements and what the state wants us to do, that we have to do this. That's what I'm hearing, but I don't agree with that, because I don't think that is truly the case.
And I think maybe to that comment, I think the standards need to be clear and objective, whatever we have in our code. And what we're trying to do is target, based on our housing needs analysis, what is needed of the 2,300 roughly additional units that are needed over the next 20 years. Can we take a bite at that from, cottage cluster, planned unit development, commercial zone changes? Can we take a bite of that and have some success in addressing those needs by incentivizing those? I think that's part of that discussion. And I understand, part of this is it's important to have this open discussion, since the code's really having to be kind of reopened to some degree on this. And so this input is important as we go through this. Okay, we'll continue. Dan, let us know if you got other questions. But Jessica's going to continue okay.
All right. Jumping back in here to development standard changes we're contemplating here for R15. Again, making reference to the new cottage cluster code to direct folks to that section rather than to look at the R15 standards in particular. Also looking at changing the townhouse minimum lot size requirements from that 3,000 square feet to the 1,800 square foot. This change is really meant to encapsulate and provide opportunity for what we understand in the market to be kind of your standard 20-foot wide townhouse product, which is pretty common on the market today. And so trying to set a target that would accommodate that standard product. Again, looking at maximum townhouse groupings of 6 with that minimum 10-foot separation.
And that's a reduction from R1 where it was 20 feet between buildings?
Yes. So in the R1 district, we have a maximum of 3 units together with 20-foot separation. If you're in a PUD or propose those townhomes in a PUD in the R1, then you would get to match what is proposed here in the R15. So you get that benefit of a slightly more compressed product type. And we'll talk about other design suggestions for how we buffer that kind of that product type against existing neighborhoods when we get into the PUD section.
Is there some kind of fire review of this kind of closeness of the buildings? I mean, to have 2 buildings next to each other that are 10 feet apart, is there like a fire code standard of how close buildings can be?
I mean, there's a building and fire code, International Fire Code, IFC, I think. So yes, there are provisions for that. And my experience with it, I do a lot of work in Washington State and had worked for a couple of municipalities over there in the past. So I'll speak to that because I can say that a little more confidently.
Sure.
I know that 3 feet to the property line was kind of the standard for residential. Oftentimes when it's different product types where they're tight together, there may be requirements for fire sprinklers that address that fire code requirement, but absolutely these would have to go through building permits like any other structure would.
And just, I think maybe one other clarifier, Jessica, I think in Dow's experience on doing these, we've had a number of conversations with them, and correct me if I'm wrong, Jessica, but I think in their experience where these have been applied in terms of where townhomes have been clustered, this was part of, I think they've seen examples of that essentially that's kind of been the product type that they've seen.
Yeah, 5 feet's a very common residential setback, even for single family detached, 5 feet to a property line. So if you have 2 single family detached homes next to one another, they're 10 feet apart, right? So that's a pretty common distance. And so that mirrored kind of that standard.
Appreciate it. Thank you.
All right. So moving on to C2, in hindsight, after some of these questions, I do feel like maybe I should have done a different order, so I apologize.
I think it will make sense as we get there.
It's so hard. I have a very linear
thank you.
brain, and so going through the code in a way in which it's numerically set up is really where my head went with this. But in hindsight, we'll rethink that for February's meeting, so it's a little more fluid for everybody. So looking at the C2, the Highway Commercial District, this one took a little bit more work, really. What we looked at here is finding a way to provide an opportunity for mixed-use development in this zone, and in particular, finding and creating definitions and citing standards for both vertical and horizontal mixed use. So you'll see in the proposed code changes that we talk about ways in which you can get mixed use in either of those scenarios. So vertical meaning, ground floor commercial and residential above, or some combination thereof. Right now, we're proposing that you reserve a minimum of 25% of that ground floor as non-residential use, and then beyond that, you can have it for residential purposes. In the horizontal mixed use concept, it would require the preservation of about 40% or 40% of the net site area for non-residential uses. And we were specific with net site area because we wanted to recognize that there are going to be some amenities on the site that are going to be dual purpose, right? You're going to have some landscaping, some buffering, some parking, some driveway accesses that will really serve both purposes. And so trying to find a way to recognize that and to put a reasonable metric together of how you provide different use composition there.
If I could maybe add just a little bit. On the C2 zone, currently vertical mixed use, like you would, not as maybe at the scale of the Dahlia, but that's essentially allowed in we're focusing on the south side of 99, not on the north side, not in the downtown area. This is C2, not C1, which is in the downtown. The idea here is to look at both vertical mixed use in that configuration like the Dahlia, and horizontal mixed use, which currently is not allowed at all in the commercial C2 zone. Again, this is trying to provide opportunities where there may be a mixture of commercial and residential uses that coexist together. Over time, I think 99E is going to look differently. It's going to have a different feel to it. There might be more connectional points to the downtown, for example. There's definitely going to be food carts along 99. There's going to be other things that happen as the town continues to mature over the next 20 years. So as part of that vision, residential could be a component of that. And again, this is an option. This is not to say residential shall go in there, but because it's not allowed now, it'd be an option to add that into the mix if somebody were to do either redevelopment or new development along 99. That's kind of the purpose of this. So.
The other key change that we're proposing here is to establish a minimum residential density in this mixed use scenario. And the idea here is to really ensure that where you're foregoing commercial development, you're getting meaningful residential density. And so we kind of took a shot in the dark. We talked internally as a team about what density made sense. I definitely am interested to hear from the Planning Commission tonight their thoughts on that minimum density. On all of this, obviously, but definitely that one, since it was kind of an internal discussion about where that number might sit. But I do encourage us to really think about setting that minimum density, because it is, you are foregoing that commercial option, right? You are taking that residential in place of the commercial, and so finding and setting a target to make sure it's meaningful, I think is important to think about and consider with this update. All right, and with that, just a couple of development standard updates specific to this particular zone. We are talking about reducing, there's a really large front yard setback on 99E. It's 20 feet right now, which means that there is a lot of land and capacity for parking, for landscaping, for buffering, for buildings that is being lost by that maximum setback. So we're proposing that minimum front yard setback be removed, that there be a maximum setback of 5 feet, unless there's some sort of amenity space like a cafe, like a sidewalk cafe or something that's connected to a coffee shop, or even just some sort of courtyard or amenity space to support the residential. Some way in which you kind of activate that area between the building and 99 in a way that is beneficial to either residents or visitors to that particular site. But really trying to make sure that we're not losing the capacity of that space to a 20-foot setback.
There are some newer developments along 99 that do have this kind of feel to them, and Dal pointed them out. I don't have the exact business. I thought it was a pizza place, but yeah, anyway, I'm spacing the name. But anyway, it's within that 5-foot range. It's a lot closer, and again, trying to create that enclosure kind of a little bit more so than the sea of asphalt, kind of where you have a parking lot as your main front to your building, but actually allowing buildings to come closer to the street, which is pretty common in a lot of corridors. That's really the idea behind that. And it also allows more opportunity to maximize development on sites.
Yeah,
And it's become more pedestrian oriented over time as well. Go ahead.
Yeah, I was going to say, there's definitely some efficiency gained, right, by putting some of that extra space on the back side of the building to provide wider walkways or additional parking and things like that. As we're looking to provide opportunities for mixed use, there's this idea, or I think an expectation, that you're going to pack more into that site. And so to the extent we can offer up ways and more flexibility in how that site lays out, the better. And reducing that front setback seemed to be a pretty important step in that direction.
Does height come into discussion on mixed use at all?
We did talk a little bit about height. We have not proposed any change to the height at this point. It is still set at, I believe, 45 feet. Am I remembering that?
Yeah, it's more than you would think it is. And so that was a kind of lively discussion we had on this. I mean, it already is pretty allowable. I mean, and again, I think it's trying to vision a little bit about creating maybe a little different character. It probably will always be auto intensive to some degree. It's on 99E, but I've seen this in other 99 scenarios throughout this area. And some of them have turned out quite well. I mean, sometimes there's a mix of different types, but the ones that are more pedestrian oriented, clearly, I think are more attractive in that sense of, not just for pedestrians, but I think they just, essentially look nicer if that can be done. Nothing wrong if you can't do that or if you leave your development the way it is, but the 1940s, 1950s, or I'm not sure the exact origin of 99 what our development envelope is here, but things were done differently back in the day. And I think part of that is, we're a much bigger community than we were back in the day. And I think 99E at one point was I-5 before I-5 came in World War II. So these are things to consider about our community as we evolve.
We see, at least in the trades, we see a lot of, we call them pedestal buildings. So, 5/1, 3/1/2, and so there's a lot of different diversity in the type of mixed-use buildings. So I just was kind of curious if there was a sense for, hey, we're going to look at a 5/1 or, a 5/1/2 with a 2 levels of parking below, that kind of thing.
I think it would be probably pretty hard to, I'm just guessing that, underground parking would be a challenge in terms of cost. I think our market probably may not be at that point, but could there be a more creative way of creating, a facade that's more, friendly than, what right now it's the feel is like, how quickly can you get through the area?
Mm-hmm. All right, thank you.
Yeah.
Well, I don't have a way to raise my hand on this get up that I got going here, but question on that. So, 99 isn't our road, number one. And so my question would be, we pulled it off with the Fred Meyer development. We don't have parking lots right up to the front. We've got sidewalks, we've got pedestrian walkways. It looks nice. I don't quite understand how changing this in the way that we're talking about changing it is beneficial at all. We pulled it off with the Fred Meyer thing. I'm not exactly sure why we wouldn't look at it, especially because 99E is not our road. I don't know what the state setbacks or requirements are, but I'm not too sure I'm jumping up and down to have a whole bunch of buildings right 5 feet away from 99E. I think that's dangerous. I think it's, I'm not too sure that's very, very smart thing to do. I think we pulled it off there at Fred Meyer. I don't know, I don't remember whether it was an exemption to what we did, but we did it there. Now, I grant it, as you get on the other side of the tracks and you go into the older side of town, there are parking lots in front and so on and so forth. But as you say, that's just the way we did things back in those days. Moving forward, though, I think that we've accomplished what we need to accomplish with a nice looking development along 99E. So I don't quite understand why we wouldn't do it on a case-by-case basis. And because we're going to have to work with the state anyway as far as setbacks are concerned. And then there's the whole safety issue. So bringing those buildings all the way 5 feet away from 99E from a highway does not seem to make a lot of sense to me. So
Is it the product type that draws the distinction?
Yeah, and I think maybe, you know, what I would recommend maybe for our next round here is to get some visuals on this, Commissioner Ewert, so that we could maybe go through and talk more specifics, because I think you might be surprised on some buildings that you might really like that are really close to the street. I mean, I'm just, again, you may hate these, but I would like to have the opportunity to present them to you and say, so what's wrong with this scenario? And I think that would be helpful to have some specific case information to go through as we go through this discussion. Because I think right now we're probably talking conceptually about some things, and I don't think there's enough information that we provided to you all to really come to a consensus on this item, is my feeling. All we're saying is, yeah, if that's
yeah,
fair.
I'm just saying that we, as far as I'm concerned, we do have some buildings that I think are too close to 99E. And the dump trucks and the logging trucks, and all the other semi trucks and everything going down there, pick one. Maybe Lex Schwab, for example. So Judy, go ahead.
Sorry, I didn't want to interrupt you. I'm piling on a little bit. I'm more worried about Ivy. So 99E, it would seem like, let's say there's a certain glass company on a corner that goes away, and that's like right up against the street. But I'm assuming if that went away, there'd be a sidewalk requirement. So there'd be a buffer of a sidewalk and something between 99 and whatever went in there. But what about Ivy? I mean, that building has been hit. You know, the traffic signals have been hit there. That's a dangerous, dangerous corner. So to do anything to reduce the setback there, to me, is dangerous.
Yeah, and Commissioner Jarosh, I think that was one basis, I think, in our current code. We definitely can look at Ivy, and I think that is a probably more unique circumstance there on that street. I think we're looking at a segment here of this corridor, and I think maybe there's some treatment that we could give as options. I think what we're really trying to do is just not have unnecessarily large swaths. I'm not talking about Ivy, large swaths of pavement that is unusable except for parking in front of a building. And I think if we could bring some photos back and you guys can provide some additional commentary, and if at the end of the day you say, no, we're not interested in doing anything but what's there now, we can go that route, but I would like to have an opportunity to present further on this.
Is a
I'd
setback,
just like to see some things on South Ivy, because that's where we have a really bad situation, I think.
Okay.
is a setback of 5 feet in addition to the required sidewalk, or is that the 5 foot of sidewalk is the 5 feet?
You could have a combination. The whole thing could be like a widened sidewalk, or you could have something in front of it'd be a private entity, you'd be on your property. You could have a somewhat of a widened sidewalk situation where you could have a sidewalk cafe, and again, I know that there's probably like mixed feelings about that, but I mean, there are places that have quite a bit of traffic that have sidewalk cafes throughout this area. So it really is a matter of, I think, giving some examples further on that.
I don't know if we have a sidewalk standard for South Ivy.
I was
Do
just
we?
gonna, I was just
I don't
gonna
think
ask
so.
that, Commissioner Jarosh, was, I don't remember seeing anything, but, and the other question to dovetail onto what you were saying was, do we have the flexibility to call out corner lots on mixed use and different setbacks based on corner lots versus lots that are just on frontage, not on corners? Is that a doable?
I think that would be a reasonable safety issue, and I think I believe it'd meet the clear and objective piece, because we're treating them all, if there's a legitimate safety issue and like if buildings are getting hit, et cetera, that we're not promoting that. I mean, we're looking at this more on usability, and I mean, to be honest, I think redevelopment, especially in redevelopment scenarios, you get to a certain point where a building there's an age to a building. There's a life to everything. And so as people start to redevelop, I mean, what do we want this to look like? Do we want it to be perpetuated from what it started as in 1940, 1950, or should it look different than it does today?
I'd love to get a Google Earth of North Interstate. If you can maybe use that as an example of when they build right up to the road, essentially that 5-foot setback, because they went through a massive redevelopment all up and down North Interstate, and the ones that are on the frontage there, the minimum setback, I mean, they had to move power poles and they had to do everything, but the ones on the corner, they've got these huge aprons on the corner lots, and I'm assuming that Portland, in its infinite wisdom, wrote something into the code to allow for these larger setback area on these corners.
Might even be site distance as well, right? Like-
Yeah.
That was my primary
Yeah,
concern.
I mean, none of this would preclude site distance, which is a safety consideration, right?
Right.
Well, but for every entrance and exit, site distance is an issue. And if we're allowing development right up to basically the road, then it's not just an issue of being concerned about corner lots, it's anywhere that there would be an entrance and exit off of 99.
And
that I would be concerned about
Again,
that.
I think those are all good points, but again, the entire building, we're not talking about a building covering the entire site area either up to the driveway. So I think it's a case-by-case situation. I mean, obviously, we message received. I
I just want to know if the possibility
yeah.
exists for us to call that out
Yeah.
and have those, that's all.
No, I think we absolutely can. I think, again, just like looking at it, 20 years from now, hopefully the decisions we make today makes it look better than it is now. Safety is a concern, totally, so noted, but just, I think these are the kinds of things that we're trying to also, at the same time, create opportunities to have, a mix of residential activity in those areas. Yeah.
I think if we could see the visuals that you were talking about, that would help a lot, because I'm just having a heck of a time wrapping my mind around it. So I think that would be really helpful.
And that's something we can bring back, so, yeah.
Thank you.
Right. I think the last one is pretty straightforward, really just providing some clarity in the code that architectural features like chimneys, if you have parapets that are hiding mechanical equipment on the top of your roofs, that those things are not, they're not habitable space, and so therefore wouldn't be included in that high limit. We thought providing this clarity would help maximize the use of that existing 45-foot height to allow development to really take full advantage of that 45 feet and exclude those items. We did grab this language from City of Hillsborough, which we thought it was a pretty inclusive set of code language, definitely open to modifications, but we thought it did a good job of giving scenarios in which it was applicable. All right. PUDs at long last. Thanks for everybody's patience. Similar to the other codes we talked about, we're starting first with uses and what are permitted outright. So in this particular code update, we are seeking to clarify that any uses that are identified as either permitted or conditional in the base zone. So if you have a PUD that's proposed in R1, any uses identified as permitted or conditional can be proposed as part of a PUD, but also clarifying that if that use is conditional, of course, a conditional use permit would couple with that PUD application. So just providing that clarity. The other thing we're proposing here is that if a PUD is proposed across multiple zones, so if you have, a 10-acre site and 5 each in R1 and R15, that the code makes it clear that uses that are allowed in both those base zones could be spread across the PUD regardless of where that zoning line sits. And we'll talk about how we think that could be applied in PUDs in a way that is conscious of existing development. But ultimately, the goal there is just to provide that flexibility and recognize that the PUD process gives that discretion to look at different ways in which a development can be proposed and also be compatible with the surrounding areas or surrounding uses, excuse me.
Comment. On your bullet number 3.
Yes.
I think it's way too broad. I just, as we go into this and we discuss this, you're going to have to convince me that that is necessary.
Okay,
So I'm just throwing that out there.
that is fair. I appreciate that.
And Commissioner Ewert, as we dive into this further, let's continue that dialogue. So go ahead.
All right, looking at the development standard updates that we're making. First, as if you've reviewed any PUDs, you know that there's that kind of the offset or the standard you see with a PUD is this requirement for an open space, and that's really one of the paramount or pillar kind of features that come out of that PUD process is that open space. And what we're seeking to do here is to clarify that space be usable to ensure that it's really benefiting the community and the city, that you're really getting something for giving that flexibility under this code. We are amending it we are also looking at ways in which we can incentivize cottage clusters as part of the PUD. And one idea we had and have proposed as part of the update is to exclude cottage clusters that are in PUDs from that open space requirement. So the best way I can describe this is by an example, and we did put it in your packet, and I'm going to copy it verbatim because math on the fly is not my strong suit. But the idea here is that if you have a PUD development that is 20 gross acres, and 1 acre of that PUD is a cottage cluster, when calculating that open space requirement for the PUD, we would actually base it off of 19 acres, recognizing that we want to incentivize that cottage cluster. And so essentially it reduces that overall open space requirement, but recognizing that cottage clusters have their own open space provision. And so there is still, requirements for that open space to have, for that cottage cluster to have open space, but it gives the ability to basically not double dip for that cottage cluster. Go ahead.
And just wanted to add, so starting out with a premise of 15%, the open space needs to be 15% of the site area. So just to add what Jessica's saying, so the carve out, the math would be different in the sense that the cottage cluster would essentially be excluded and would have its own, we haven't got to that point yet, but will have its own standards internally, but it's excluded from that equation. But with the starting point that the PUD has to have a minimum of 15% usable open space.
Good clarification. So in the example I provided, instead of 3 acres as the standard 15% for a 20-acre cottage or 20-acre PUD, if we do it based off that 19 acres, you get 2.85 acres for the PUD itself, but then the cottage cluster also has an expected open space calculation, and that's based on, right now, the proposal is 150 square feet per unit in the cottage cluster. So, there's, depending upon the density of that cottage cluster, you may net more overall, just based on that math. But the idea here is to really incentivize the diversity of housing in that PUD. And we think that one way in which you can do that is to provide that slight benefit in that open space calculation.
Would there be some kind of exception if the cottage cluster does not meet that minimum of 12 units to require open space?
We require that, it's a good question, so we didn't get there yet, but spoiler alert, we require cottage clusters to have a minimum of 4 units, and you are required to have what we call a common courtyard with a cottage cluster. So there's no scenario in which you wouldn't have a courtyard with those units. It just might be pretty small based on the number of units you're proposing.
Oh, everything I read, it always referred to 12 units as a minimum for the 150 per.
I don't.
I could revisit it, or we could.
Yeah, no, and I think when we get to the cottage cluster, let's dive into that. And before we start going back into the planned unit development, I think PUDs are a little bit more quantifiable. We're dealing with a large chunk, normally of 15% open space. It's probably generally in one area. Just as a precursor to our discussions on cottage clusters, they are a form-based design, meaning that you meet a formula of situations. It's not a density-driven product. It's a form-based product. PUDs are more of a, you have an open space and you have some commonality, whether it's a golf course or it's usually a larger amenity that the 15% is made up of, that people are, not always, but it's a larger scale with that being the foundational piece of it. Whereas the cottage is going to be really, all of the units are oriented to that open area. So that was, just wanted to clarify.
Coupled with our proposal to add that minimum or maximum density, for R1, we are adding a provision in the PUD to require that PUDs adhere to the base zone's density unless they go for that density bonus. We did also, or have also proposed some specific and more robust criteria for when that density bonus should be applied to help offer up some parameters for implementation of that density bonus to really encourage and make sure, again, we're getting kind of our bang for our buck as we allow for that additional density, that it's really benefiting the development itself and the city as a whole. All right. Also proposing that cottage clusters are not included in the maximum density calculation. So whether it's a PUD under the base zone with no density bonus, any cottage clusters that are contemplated or proposed as part of the PUD would not count towards it. So if you have a PUD that's 6, then the R1, and it's 6 units per acre, and it's a 10-acre site, you get 60 units. If you have 60 housing units and 12 cottages, you're okay because you're meeting that density, because cottage units do not count towards that density. Does that scenario make sense? The idea is to, again, provide for or create an incentive for that cottage cluster, which gives that diversity in housing without necessarily impacting the underlying density that you could get under the PUD.
I want to defer to our previous, man, I need pictures. I'm trying to keep up, but that exercise we did in that town hall at the police station where we moved everything around and had to fit everything onto the different lot, that would be really helpful for me, at least. I'm trying to keep up with.
No, I hear you, and I think that we had several conversations around I think it's important to introduce the topical issues. Obviously, the graphics are important. We wanted to get the hot button items. You obviously are providing hot button items tonight. We're going to come back and address those hot button items, and then we're going to come back with graphics. Some of those you've already seen, but it's been a month or so since we last visited that. Yeah. I think some of the graphics that Dal previously provided are really good as an examples. They had some where there was a PUD and there was a subset of a cottage development within the PUD. That situation is an opportunity. To be honest, in larger development acreage, that that might happen, that scenario might happen. I don't think there's a lot of that opportunity yet, in this, in Canby for what's existing in the city limits and the current urban growth boundary. There's not probably a lot of opportunity necessarily to do these combos, but we felt it was important to kind of make sure that somebody that like, hey, can I stack these? And I'll do a PUD, but I'm going to do a cottage development as part of that. And that provides a lot of those dynamics where you have a mix of housing, which some places call messy vitality or whatever you want to call it, and that creates kind of the, some very attractive energies and also affordabilities to provide for those product types that we're really needing, that our housing needs analysis is identifying. So you might get some creative developers that want to combine these. You may have people.
And that's what scares me,
Yeah.
because I'm like, okay, man,
Yeah.
we really got to be on the ball with how you can mix and match all of these and still adhere to the code, because I have faith in my valued GCs that they're going to want to maximize every dollar they can per square foot. So if they get creative, we just got to be really clear on how that works.
Yep. Yeah, so noted and, understood.
Yeah, I want to chime in on that too, because when we talked about this before, we talked about the possibility of doing this on a case by case. If you got a developer that wants to come in, he wants to do cottage cluster thing, we sit down, we look at it, we've got a zone, we've got a code, not a zone, but a code outline for cottage clusters, and if he can make that fit into a development, i.e. some developments that we already have got going on that aren't building out, I think that, personally, I think that's a much better way to do it. We talked about this, to encourage them to go ahead, and if they're interested in doing that, to make it a proposal. And we'll look at it and we'll do it. But just to make it say, yeah, you can do it whenever. I'm just not jumping up and down in that. And then I also want to point out that everybody keeps throwing this affordable housing thing in there. We looked at these cottage cluster houses. They were expensive in the examples that were shown by the consultant. This isn't affordable housing. We're not creating affordable housing by changing our code to allow cottage clusters. These cottage cluster houses were going for $200,000 and $300,000 a piece, and they were just
More like 5.
little dinky little things. So I think using the whole terminology about affordable housing is incorrect, in my opinion.
And Commissioner Ewert, to your point, I would obviously say they're more affordable. They may not be completely affordable, but they're more affordable. And the idea behind this is, again, to target back based on need, which is based on the housing needs analysis and providing those product types that are within those ranges. And we'll be doing a deeper dive on December 11th to talk more about those income levels and where people are at and what they need for housing. Those are far more affordable cottage clusters than traditional developments, which are probably $600,000 or $700,000 homes, which are way out of reach of people that are trying to buy a house. So yes, the difficulty is, unless we get to the point where we're doing some sort of subsidy, public-private partnership, and those are not on the table at this point. Council would obviously have to be involved with that. But unless we're going to be going that direction, it's very, very difficult to have completely affordable housing, but part of it is trying to meet the needs that we can meet, that we know that are already quantified. Yes, they're not cheap. I agree, they're not cheap, but they're far less expensive, and they are product types that would be needed in this community.
Commissioner Driscoll?
Yeah, so a concern that I have in just this high-level overview is it doesn't seem that there are specific guardrails built into the PUD code. I understand we would want to encourage the cottage development by saying, hey, we don't necessarily need to count that in the density, but what precludes them from buying a bunch of land in R1 because it's a desirable area, doing almost entirely cottage clusters at a density that we don't have any parameters of, because we're saying, hey, you're going to build a couple single-family homes and then you're going to build primarily cottage clusters, then that seems out of alignment with respecting the existing density boundaries of R1, R1.5, whatever. I want to encourage more of it, but I wouldn't want it to just go completely off the rails, which I could definitely see a developer wanting to take advantage of if we're not really clear and prescriptive about that.
And I think the examples are the ones that we should provide, which should be part of that additional conversation. Is it a change in the type of housing that's out there? Yes. Is it needed? Yes. I mean, I think, is it a challenging thing to not have houses that you've had here that are, every house is not going to look like every other house here.
Sure.
Or there will be no affordability, period. And we're not going to meet any of the needs of the housing needs analysis. So I think that's really the dynamic. But I do think that, as we get into this further, more examples of PUDs, and Jessica's going to dive into the cottage cluster development standards of what those are. I think part of the overall challenge really is there is a huge need out there, and there is a need for us as communities to recognize that, and that is a critical need. And that means houses that look different than people that have had houses here before. But that's part of the need. And as hard as that is to say, it's based on clear and objective standards, and Oregon's a leader in that discussion, which means that what should those clear and objective standards be? Because that essentially is where things are at. I mean, those are the things that we have as boundaries here. So I guess what I would ask the commissioners to look at is, what are the clear and objective standards that you feel would be needed here? I also know that there are developers that want to do cottage developments, in the community, and they're interested in providing that niche of product type that I think is highly needed here in this community. So could there be some really awesome places that are developed? Yes, I think there could be, with what this looks like. Is it a change from traditional single-family large lots with large houses? Absolutely.
Oh, and I think it's great, and I don't think it's a bad thing at all that we're pushing towards this. I'd love to see it happen and more. Like I said, my perspective is just kind of not blindsiding people who live in areas that they expect to be R1 single family, and we're almost kind of like under the radar saying, oh, well, guess what? We're just going to have these, huge clusters of houses popping up in your backyard unexpectedly. I just want to make sure we're finding that balance between respecting that and still encouraging the growth and allowing for the different building types.
So for example, a developer buys 20 acres and says, I'm going to develop it, and then it decides he's just going to do a 100% cottage cluster.
Or 18 acres of it, a cottage
Or
clusters, whatever,
Yeah.
because they're going to make a lot of money that way, but it's going to be outside of the spirit of what we're trying to do too, because while we are concerned about more housing, we don't necessarily want it to all be cottage clusters exclusively, because that's where they're making their money.
So I have another technical question. Can we, as a planning commission, recommend a percentage base of cottage cluster in every development like that? Like a maximum, like a not to exceed?
I mean, my thought is, to Commissioner Driscoll's concern, maybe the solution would be to set a cap on those units that don't count towards the density, right? That maybe your first 12 units, and I'm just throwing this out as an example. Because I think in your scenario, that wouldn't be in the spirit of the code, absolutely. I do think there are some design criteria that we haven't quite got to yet. It's my next mouse click. But we do talk about ways in which higher intensity uses need to be internal to the PUD to really recognize and provide that compatibility with adjacent lower density residential uses, which I think would get at some of your concern. It wouldn't fix 18 acres of cottage clusters. cluster
Yeah,
for sure.
yeah.
But I do think, we tried to take a proactive approach to address the edges and to really understand a way to kind of bevel and create that kind of transition zone between existing lower density uses and how they might marry up with higher intensity uses you could see in a PUD scenario.
And actually, I saw that. I really like that. And
Oh,
I think we
good.
should apply it across the board for all of our development, regardless of zone, so that as we're building up, we're kind of doing it incrementally. We're not just taking a one-story, 20-some-odd foot house and like plopping something 40 foot next to it, because, that really impacts people's sense of pride in their, neighborhood, in their own home, and their ability to, just enjoy where they already live before this big monstrous thing showed up next door. If there's just a incremental step height that we use for kind of like density within existing zones, if we did that for some of the newer development too, I think we could continue to retire old homes, build new, and just kind of not have it be such stark contrast to what's already there. Same thing with
I think the height would be
centralizing
a
it.
challenge for residential because usually it's pretty similar across housing product types, 35 feet. But I think there could be a way in which we get at that solution through like lot size or something to that effect. I know that's a pretty common one when you're addressing kind of traditional single family detached. As they go down in lot size, you kind of have this transition zone. So maybe there's a way in which we prescribe that a little more clearly than just lower intensity uses. We tried to be a bit broad with that initial brush strokes at that code change, but I think we could get more prescriptive there to make it more clear about what the expectation is as you transition between those housing products.
Yeah, I'd like you to just consider what are the surrounding existing buildings and their heights.
Do you feel like it's important to have it, not to put you on the spot, but just curious, do you feel like it's important to have those transitions happening inside the PUD or really just at that edge? Do you kind of feel like you kind of know what you're getting into if you're buying a house in the middle of the PUD and you got, versus really protecting those existing homes and properties on the exterior?
I don't have as strong of a feeling about within the new construction itself,
Sure.
because I would be inclined to say, you kind of know what you're getting into, you're going to see what the plans are, what the development is, and you're going to be able to make that decision. Does it work for me when I choose to put down my roots in this home? So for me, I'm a little bit more concerned about existing and how to integrate new with existing than just within the PUD, but I really liked seeing the recommendation of having the taller, larger buildings central to it so that it kind of feathers out into the surrounding lower density.
And on the PUD side of things, we absolutely can add text on that transitionary piece of this. The cottage development, cottage cluster is going to be more difficult. That's a form of middle housing. So when we get to that point, we'll have that discussion around that piece. That is really more about, do you think the form, and again, we don't have the graphics tonight, but do you think the form is, to be a little argumentative here, that, when we get to cottage developments, the idea behind it is you're building a community, and so to that extent, it's not like you're trying to go in and just like create something that's completely, not consistent with what's around it, but rather really it's about community building here in the end, which is, there's an attractive element to that arguably is probably even more intense in terms of design than somebody doing a traditional development. Because some of that character of like, common open areas is not even addressed, and it's not something we require in our code. So, and planning and development is a larger scale of that, and because it is one that's an option and not a middle housing form, it can have more discretion to it. So we have more ability to deal with that. The only thing, and this may be a question for Kelly, and when we get to cottage developments, is the scale of cottage developments. Could there be some, maybe at some point it's a PUD that has more discretion elements to it versus a cottage development. That's my only thought on that. But I don't want to go too far astray here, so.
We're so close.
Yeah.
The last 2 bullet points, guys, you did so good. So just kind of closing the loop on the conversation we were just having about the more intense uses being towards the center. This kind of supports the bullet that happened just before that, which talks about the ability to spread density across the PUD. So again, in a scenario where you have an R1 and an R15, you have kind of an overall max density for your PUD, but kind of to offset and give the flexibility to create that beveling and that transition around the perimeter, we can conversely allow for the product types and the density to kind of blend internally in a way that maximizes and creates a good, plan form and development layout, but also gives that protection around the perimeter. So it's kind of a tit for tat, right? So we give a little, they give a little, and that's the idea there.
So in kind of blending the two overlapping zones, is it kind of a not to exceed total density of the chunk of land that was?
Correct. Yeah, there would be, and that's where we got, it was, I think, it was a bullet point a little further up on the slide. But yes, the idea is that the base zone sets your max density in the PUD. You do have that potential for that density bonus, but you have to give a little to get that density bonus. And again, you're still putting yourself at that maximum amount of units. The one caveat is whether or not we want to give any sort of exemption to cottage units, and maybe we don't, or maybe we set a max on that, but regardless, there is still that maximum density calculation that happens for any PUD.
Okay. And could you share a little bit more about what the bonus
Oh, sure.
criteria
I
is?
didn't go into it here. I was trying to be high level, but it is in your packet, and I can read it, which is not as good as seeing it on the screen. But the idea is to give some more clear criteria for when that's appropriate. So making sure that the developer is really doing something to get that bonus. So the 4 bullet points we call out, it's on page 2 of the 16.67 chapter that we provided. The first is existing and proposed streets within and connecting to the development site will support the proposed density. I think that's kind of obvious, right? We want to make sure that the street structure, the access to those lots is appropriate for the scale. Existing water and sanitary sewer, storm drainage, all those things can support the additional density. The development demonstrates innovative site design, outstanding architectural variety, and quality construction to mitigate that increased density. So again, it's kind of looking at how you modify the look of the development to support that additional density and not kind of create a burden or an incompatibility with adjacent development at the kind of base zone. Yes.
I was just going to have David speak. He has his hand raised. David, please.
Thanks, Don. I guess a quick comment, and maybe it's somewhat of a question for me too. Thanks for having me tonight. It's nice to be with you all. I'm obviously a little bit new to the specifics here of what you're doing, specific to Canby. I know the issues, I'd like to think fairly well, but I guess one question or point that I wanted to make is with respect to the idea of what would prevent a developer from potentially coming in and saying, I'm just going to do a 100% cottage cluster development. Market issues, putting that aside, I think that'd be pretty unlikely. I guess legally, I just want to be sure that I'm operating under the right set of facts. So Canby is considered to be a medium-sized city, or it hasn't passed that yet. It's still within that range.
That's my understanding, David, and I think Kelly can confirm that. We're under 25,000.
Okay, great. So the only, I mean, from a middle housing point of view, then, I mean, the only thing that would be required of Canby would be to allow duplexes on any lot that a single family lot would be permitted, right? Everything else beyond that is going to be, at this point, given it's going to be something that the city would choose to do. I think it's a good idea, especially when you're talking about looking at a UGB expansion. The state's going to want to see, efficiency built into that. But just to sort of give some reassurance, if that's the right word, I think that there wouldn't be anything that would entitle a developer to come in and say, I just want to have a development full of triplexes or quadplexes or cottage clusters. And I think that you'd be, with clear and objective language, of course, you'd be able to limit that if you choose to allow cottage clusters in some form. I think you could also say whether it's a percentage of overall units, something that would say, however, we don't want that to predominate or be everything, right? That's just a matter of how you word that. So that was just my point. In the middle of that, I thought maybe you're beyond that 25,000 now, but knowing that you're not, I think at most you're going to have to allow duplexes for every single family home. That somebody could come in and do.
And I think on the middle housing, David, that's our understanding as well. Part of the equation here is the urban growth boundary piece that we have to do efficiency measures to connect the two together. There's a need, there's a housing need. We know there's a housing acreage demand, currently about 129 acres of urban growth boundary expansion, and so we have to do efficiency measures. Part of that is that's something we also know that needs to be done as well to reach the populations that people that have housing needs, and we have those quantified. So that all kind of, there's several things in play here that are part of that, and I think we're trying to find the middle here. I think the commentary from the Planning Commission is really good on trying to understand the limits of what this is and is not. And I think this is our first cut, to be honest. I mean, this is an ongoing discussion here, and there's a lot of information being provided tonight. So I think all that being said, and I think, what we're trying, Jessica I'm sorry, we interrupted your flow there, but I think, on the PUD, maybe since we've chosen these three efficiency measures, trying to make this tailored to, and that's the word I think of the day, is tailored to Canby to try to address concerns, but in a clear and objective way is really, I think, what we're trying to figure out. And your help with that would be really appreciated.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, my pleasure. And I certainly, just to be clear, I think it's a good idea, and foresight, and also to how the UGB expansion will play out, to consider things like cottage clusters and even though it doesn't seem that affordable, you're certainly going to be able to have, allow for a lot more people to be able to reach the potential for ownership. I just wanted to be also sure that, folks didn't think that it was like kind of a binary. If we allow some, do we have to allow it for everything? I think you have some discretion there in terms of policy as to how that would play out. And that's a good thing.
And I think that piece about, I do not want us to be precluding developers that in the right areas, and we already have some of that are planned, from being able to do and exercise some of these efficiency measure elements. And, part of the challenge is clear and objective standards don't really acknowledge what's currently there, but if there are other standards that we can put in place about how large these can be, and maybe that gets too specific, but if there's information on that which, tries to quantify where that is, or geographically where that is in the city, that would be helpful to understand better. Because, these R1 and R15 zones are ubiquitous across the city, so that's the challenge. So David, hang on for more commentary. So Jessica, go ahead.
Okay.
Yeah.
So I think we're pretty much wrapped on the PUD. I do think, just to kind of dovetail off of the chatter just now, a couple of things to think about as it relates to our comments earlier about, cottage clusters as part of PUDs. Again, this is the PUD path is that more discretionary path. So we do have that ability to put those guardrails on it. And really, this is our first touch at it. It's not going to hurt my feelings if you hate it. So I think to the extent you can provide that feedback, it's really helpful. And I think it's a good point. Definitely not our intention for it to kind of go the reverse and be predominantly cottage and not kind of other housing types. So it is a good critique, and writing code is often a long exercise. So I think that was a good comment. And as we get into the cottage cluster, we'll talk more about how form-based codes really sets the density by virtue of those characteristics. And so with that, we finally are on cottage cluster. We made it, guys. Thank you for bearing with me. This gets more involved and more text heavy, if you can imagine that. So I apologize. Again, we're trying to keep this super high level. There's lots of information in your packet. I think it's important to preface these slides by saying that we took a lot of guidance from the model code as we implemented this. We did definitely cater it to Canby, specifically to comments that you shared with my my counterparts, Matt and Reed, in this kind of first round of edits before I got brought onto the project. And so we definitely tried to integrate those here. We worked really closely with both Don and Ryan on these updates. And so, but they are they're based off of that model code, which we think is a really good starting place, given the eventual requirement to follow that once you become a middle or a medium-sized city. So.
And just to echo, I think that Dow also brings perspective in that they've developed code elsewhere, and they have experience with cottage clusters, and that has been something that the model code has been successful in implementation. We've also asked some local developers what their thoughts are on this, and that might be interested in doing this, and they were also on board as well. So that's just a starting point for discussion here tonight.
And also an early run through with Kelly and her team, which we appreciate your feedback on that, Kelly, so quickly. So we're doing our best to bring forward a code that we think is defensible as far as it relates to clear and objective standards, but also is really trying to hit the bullseye with kind of blending in with Canby's kind of goals. So with that high level look here, permitted uses in the R1 and R15 zones, as we discussed, they can be permitted as a standalone development in those zones or within a PUD. Approval process, as we touched on a little bit earlier in the presentation tonight, there is some discussion about, how that approval process goes forward and whether it's clear and objective. At this point, we're proposing cottage clusters that are standalone to go through a type 2 process, and those that are in a PUD would go through the standard PUD procedures. We're also considering cottage clusters that are proposed as part of a subdivision to also be subject to a type 2 process, which I understand is different than what Canby currently has. And I think we are interested in some kind of feedback from Kelly and or David on kind of what our what Canby's what Canby can do as far as regulating that process to a type 3, either by number of cottage clusters, if you reach a certain number that it goes through a type 3 process, or if the subdivision alone is sufficient and appropriate to go through that type 3. It's a little bit untested, as Kelly mentioned earlier in the presentation. So definitely more of a question mark here.
And before we maybe dive into that, my suggestion, and fully want your input on this discussion item, but maybe, Jessica, we could dive into the standards first.
Sure.
So what are we even dealing with here? But that is an important question. Type 2 would be, it'd be administratively approved, but with notice and appealable. Type 3 is what you traditionally see as the Planning Commission, which is the hearings for these. And a standard PUD would, standard PUD alone by itself without cottage cluster would be a type 3 automatically. That's going to continue to be the situation. So the question becomes on the clear and objective standard piece of this, and this is probably a little bit of a change in maybe just the whole makeup of how Oregon land use is happening, but especially on housing, clear and objective standards are becoming the norm across the entire state, meaning that many jurisdictions, if not most of them, are doing this administratively. I've seen administrative approvals in other states for fairly large developments as well. And that, this has been something that's been going on outside of Oregon for a while, where staff is empowered to make decisions based on clear and objective standards in the code. So one thing I want you to keep in mind as we have this discussion on type 2 versus type 3 is why would a type 3 process be something that would be needed? What does, if there's no discretion, essentially, because it has to be clear and objective, what are the elements that would be part of a type 3 and why? Not to say that that can't be the case, but that's part of the discussion that we need to have. Our counterparts in many other cities our size, not all in just the metro area, but many of them are doing these administratively. And again, back to Kelly's point about undue delay and cost, there have been lawsuits filed on those items, something to be aware of. Yes, Canby can choose to be a type 3. We can also be a candidate for a lawsuit, as well. So these are the items that we have to weigh out as we go through this process, and just to foundationally start that discussion. So I'm going to turn it back over to Jessica.
That was a little doomsday of us. Sorry about that. Hindsight is 2020.
I have a comment. I have a comment.
Yes,
Hello?
please.
Go
Yeah,
ahead,
please.
Commissioner.
Please, Dan.
No, yeah. I'm not, I don't appreciate the way this conversation is going, as far as I have to say that as a planning commissioner, I've been a planning commissioner for a long time, these unveiled threats, as far as how we make our decisions, I don't appreciate that. We're a planning commission. That's what we're supposed to do. We're here to plan the city. And to say that if we don't just let staff make all the decisions, we're going to get sued, then what's the point? I got to say, I take a little bit of, matter of fact, I take a great deal of issue with that. And I don't appreciate that at all. We are here, we are appointed by our city council to do a job, and we don't have to accept this. We can do it the way Canby wants it done. And I got to say that I don't appreciate the way that this conversation just happened just now.
And
So I'm just going to throw.
No, Commissioner
that out
Ewert,
there.
I mean, I think what we're trying to do is just be transparent with what the lay of the land is in Oregon right now. I mean, I don't think we'd be doing our job if we weren't being honest with you folks. And we're not necessarily, this is really ultimately, we want your decision on a recommendation here for how we should proceed with this. And David, we knew this would be part of the discussion tonight. And I think it's just it's a recognition that these things are important to weigh out as we go through this process. Ultimately, the council will have to make a decision on that. And, if that's where we want to remain as a type 3, I think part of that is, what are we, the idea behind this is, yes, there is a role for the Planning Commission. I'm not saying there's not, but I'm saying within housing review in Oregon, it is all about clear and objective standards. And that's my point. And so the idea behind that is that those, if they're clear and objective, does that fit more appropriately into a type 2 or a type 3? And I have had some conversations with David, and, we could choose a type 3 process and continue with that, but we need to be aware of the circumstances that Oregon is in right now in terms of what the law is.
Yeah, I would say, and Commissioner Irward, certainly none of this is in the context of wanting to. I think exactly right. I mean, this is really as much about like us making sure that you all know sort of how much state law has currently sort of written out a lot of the sort of discretionary decision making that the Planning Commission would do on housing. That's it, just housing applications, and that's intentional. I mean, I'm not trying to say how dare they. That's a dispute for others to or a discussion for others to have, but it is really part of the overall package of policy that's come from the legislature over the past maybe 5-6 years, even more than that, I guess, because that was 2017 to change the statute. But be that as it may, really the point here is not so much like telling you what you can and can't do. By no means am I here to do that. I want to be sure you do know, that right now, the more that as frustrated as clients are about this, that when it comes to getting housing applications in, and I've been through hours and hours and hours of hearings on this, and it really just takes a look at that certain LUBA case law from the past 3 years to see how unsuccessful communities have been in basically trying to look at provisions in their code that are subjective and try to apply those to any type of housing application. It's not just a remand I heard earlier, from LUBA. It's actually reversals, not a remand to like say, hey, city, go and take a look at this again. Maybe you need to have a stronger finding, or maybe you need to weigh the evidence differently. It's a reversal where the LUBA just says, sorry, you're not getting this back. We are basically that denial that you reached for these reasons, that are based on code language probably. We're just reversing that. It's approved, and oh, by the way, the applicant gets its attorney's fees as well. So it's done in the spirit sort of making sure that you all realize this is kind of where we are as a matter of state policy, good or bad. And trying to make sure that as you go through this process, which is already complicated enough as it is, that you've also sort of considered, these issues about clear and objective standards. There's nothing more frustrating for me as a lawyer than coming before good people like you that are, volunteering time, spending a lot of time in front of, your neighbors, and obviously committed to doing, the right thing for your community, to only tell you that, oh yeah, that standard that's in your code is very likely subjective, and with this subdivision application that you have in front of you, you just can't consider it. That's again, however you feel about that as a matter of policy, that basically is sort of where we are now. It is where we are. That it's basically, I've had that discussion, numerous times with folks, and it's unsatisfying for sure, but that's the reality.
David, thank you. And Commissioner Ewert, I think, I think we can continue the dialogue, absolutely. I mean, maybe we sidebar this whole discussion on type 2 versus type 3. But David, I mean, it would be our choice, is that correct, to choose type 3? I mean, with the understanding of the risks that the city would have, I mean, that is our choice.
Absolutely, that's your choice. There's nothing right now that says that I'm aware of that would say. Well, I will put a caveat into this in a second. But generally speaking, when it comes to looking at applications, and that's just talking again about housing right now, your average subdivision application, there's no reason why, or even PUD, certainly PUD. Let's get back to like subdivisions, the more routine housing applications. No reason why that couldn't be an application that comes initially, first and foremost, to the Planning Commission as a type 3. With a hearing immediately, no staff decision that would precede that. You could do that. It's just more a matter of, so once you get there, right, you're going to be looking at the Planning Commission having standards in front of it that are clear and objective, and making decisions that really don't get into any of the sort of, weighing of, is this good for the community, all the types of more subjective criteria that are really, a big part of a lot of land use planning. And so that's kind of where it comes down to. The caveat I was going to say is that, and I don't know how many of these you would see. It's sort of new, it's kind of rolling out, and I think we're seeing it in some communities, but it's the middle housing land division process. So you have types of middle housing, the statute defines that fairly clearly in terms of, duplexes, triplexes, quaxes, cottage clusters. Those are types of middle housing. And then there's also a process that would allow landowners, developers to go and actually have land divisions that would follow at least some of those housing types. Like a duplex is probably the most common example. Normally we think of that as a 2-unit residence on one parcel, but you can now actually go and have a land division that would create, even though it's going to be an attached building, or a duplex as we would normally think about it, but you can get a lot line down the middle of those to actually have 2 separate parcels that one could be sold, one could be kept. With respect to that process, a middle housing land division, that the state law does say can only be considered administratively. That the state law literally writes out the Planning Commission in this case. So an initial decision would have to be made administratively. And then if there is an appeal, that appeal goes to a third party. It can't be a planning commission or a city council. Typically, it would be a hearings officer or a hearings official that the jurisdiction would have to appoint. So that's the only sort of yes but part to my response, is that if you were having somebody developing middle housing and they did it through a middle housing land division, then state law does say there that the initial decision at least must be made administratively, and the appeal would go to a hearings officer.
Thank you, David. But cottage clusters could go through a type 3. It's to confirm.
Yes.
Okay, thank
They
you.
could.
Jessica, I'm sorry, we did a little bit more of a segue than I was expecting, but thank you, David.
All right, so moving into kind of the crux of the design and development standards for a cottage cluster, we're just going to kind of look high level at these. This is going to look scary at first, but we are setting or proposing a minimum density of 6 units per acre. There is no maximum. However, really the density is controlled by the requirements to have parking on site, the requirements to have those buffers, the common courtyard, the sidewalks, that sort of thing. So it really becomes that form-based code that Don was mentioning earlier, where you end up with all these different characteristics and features on the site that really prevent, extreme density in this case. We are lot area standards. We don't set a minimum target, so we didn't at this point think it made sense to say, you must have a minimum, 1 acre site to do this cottage cluster. We wanted to provide that flexibility, and again, based on some other standards that we'll talk about as far as kind of optionality of cottage unit size, we felt it made sense to not propose a minimum or maximum lot area. We are preserving perimeter yard setbacks for the street yard. So if you've got your cottage cluster up against the street, we're complying with the underlying zone. The idea there is that it creates that uniformity with that existing neighborhood that you're sitting in. So you've got an R1 zone with street setbacks. I think currently it's 20 feet. So you'd have a cottage cluster next to it. In that instance, they'd have that same 20 feet. So you'd have that continuity along the streetscape. We recognize that was a particular concern during kind of the initial discussion about cottage clusters, and thought that that would be a good solution there to really support that continuity. Side yards 5 feet and rear yard 10 feet. Number of cottages in the cluster, setting a minimum of 4. Again, kind of recognizing that the idea behind these cottages is to create a bit of a community, and it's hard to do that with 1 or 2, right? Or two or 3. So set a minimum target. I believe 4 is consistent with what the model code has. And to your point, Commissioner Driscoll, I think this might be where we hit a little bit of a snag. So I'll say for me, my intention was that it would be or fraction thereof. So if you have a cottage development that's 12 units, you still have a common courtyard. So it might just be a little bit of nuance and clarity in the code. It was not my intention for us, or our intention, I think, to say that if you have 9 cottages, you do not have a courtyard.
Yeah, that's how it read. Yeah.
Lazy language, apologies, noted. So I think a simple or fraction thereof would get at it. The goal here was to make it clear that if you had, more than 12 units, that you'd have multiple courtyards, because as you look at the standards, as we move further into the proposed code language, it becomes very difficult to put to create cottages that meet the form base with 1 courtyard,
Massive
right?
courtyard,
You really
yeah.
need multiple courtyards and multiple clusters. So the idea there was really to make it clear that as you got above 12, you started to have to add distinct courtyards to support those additional clusters. So good feedback, and I've made a note. We will clarify that.
Thank you.
I mean, it's not a cluster if there's no courtyard,
Yes.
period. It's not,
That's why I was confused.
No, but it was a really good point. It was a good add. It's a very fundamental feature for cottages, so definitely not our intention there. So great catch. All right. So building separation, we are proposing between adjacent cottages 6 feet. That's going back to your question earlier tonight about that fire code and looking at kind of that minimum separation between structures. It is subjective. If you'd like more than that, we can definitely talk about it, but that was the idea behind that, was to set that minimum target to allow those to be consistent with fire code. And then for other structures, garages, sheds, our expectation or understanding is there's a little bit of softening in that distance because it's not a habitable space. So if there is, an interest in those being further, we definitely can, but we thought we'd take a shot at that to try to, again, reduce the amount of barriers, the amount of that separation, so that you could have that optionality inside the development without excessive setbacks.
Can I ask a question real quick? Sorry.
Oh, of course.
Is Is stormwater handled differently in cottage clusters than in regular developments?
It is not. We actually proposed that same maximum impervious surface area, and it's all tied back to how stormwater is analyzed. And Don can probably do a little better job of explaining how that process is looked at for Canby.
I guess I'm just going to mention it real quick without belaboring it, but there was a storm in Canby, I don't know, a month ago that was a rain event. And a couple of subdivisions, the people, one is a very recent subdivision, and their crawl spaces flooded because the impervious, there was too much impervious, obviously, and the property's on a big expanse of clay. So the ground the ground got saturated. And so then the homeowners in this pretty new subdivision, if you want to look on Facebook, it's all public there. There was a firestorm on Facebook, and they said, why are we being told to put in sump pumps and French drains? Why was this allowed? And that's what the existing standards. So if we know we're having trouble with that, because weather seems to be changing, and I'm not a big global warming zealot, I'm just saying there was a big rainstorm, and it used to just drizzle all the time, right? And that caused a problem. So and so I looked online, and there's some cities that are reducing those numbers of impervious ground because weather events are changing. So it seems to me we don't want to change that in the other direction since we know there's a known problem in Canby. Anyway.
And Commissioner Giroux, so that the R15 actually allows 70%, and that's what we are proposing for cottage clusters, is 70%. To your point, we'll definitely look into what you're identifying.
And we're proposing 70% in R1.
And we were going to do the same. And so there is more dialogue we're having on this item with the county. They're involved with the review process on storm drainage as well. A lot of the soils here are quite good in Canby. The one you mentioned sounded like the soils was not good. But most of them are farm soils, and they have really excellent drainage. And so I'm not familiar with.
But do we take that into consideration in the development plans? I don't think so.
Well,
right? For storm drain.
Yeah, that's part of what should be considered. And to your point, I think that's something we need to get more information on from the county. They're involved with the review, essentially the storm drainage review portion of development. So there's kind of a combination between us, the city, and the county. Ultimately, the county issues building permits, and so there's a connection typically to dry wells for most developments. And but that, to your point, that's something that is part of this discussion and needs more information.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, since we haven't known that there's a known problem in a very large, fairly recent subdivision.
Okay.
I think that needs a second look. Thanks.
Thank you.
If farmland starts out with good drainage, but then it has houses built on it for, an indefinite amount of time, does it continue to have good drainage, or does it change as it settles and it's no longer being farmed?
I think over time, obviously impervious surface gets added to what's farmland. It's not been my experience that we've had much of an issue here compared to the rest of the metro area, which has some horrible soils, and, we don't see storm ponds here. That would be the question to Commissioner Giroux's point. That was unusual for me, and a lot of experience I've had has been where jurisdictions have not good drainage, and so you see ponds everywhere because that basically holds the water until it's released. Here, very uncommon, and I think historically that has been very fortunate that Canby's had that condition because unlike the rest of the metro area, it's not that way, and a lot of areas are very challenged with that. So with the impervious area, even with that, the city streets are separately addressed because that's part of the city system, and those have to meet all the, city standard, et cetera. But the private developments also have to meet a standard as well, largely really directed to the county for that piece. I've had some conversations with their storm drainage people. More conversations need to happen so that we understand this better. At the end of the day, development should not be approved that are going to cause the situation that Commissioner Giroux talked about. That's unacceptable.
Okay, thank you, Don.
Yeah.
Is our current definition of impervious just 100% impervious, or is there any, I'm not super familiar with our storm drainage criteria, but I mean, there are materials that could be solid surface that still absorb
There could be-
water.
there
Do
are-
we address that in any way, shape, or
There's,
form? of the
there's
question?
actually a definition in our code about those kinds of things. Pervious pavement would be one of those, and those, you could have those, we don't see a lot of that product here in Canby that I'm aware of, but that would be another way to deal with that issue. And that probably is something that could be included here, as well as, that these are more unique design elements, but that could be a consideration.
Yeah, to me, it
Yeah.
seems like that might be a good middle ground, because I recognize needing to allow for more quote-unquote impervious land use for, these different needs. But if we're using pervious surfaces, that might be a middle ground between what we want to achieve and making sure the water does not flood into people's homes.
Good point.
Just making a note, sorry, real quick. All right. Building height, at this point, the code is written to be 35 feet, which is consistent with the residential zones, R1 and R15. Floor area, right now, this is a little different than what the model code has. Right now, the model code is predicated on kind of a maximum footprint for a building and then an overall average size of the units within the cottage cluster. What we're proposing here is a slightly different approach, where we set kind of a minimum square foot requirement and a maximum overall. And, you can kind of, I guess, extrapolate that the minimum square foot would be kind of your minimum footprint, right? Or your maximum size would be kind of your maximum footprint, because you could in fact have like a single level cottage. So looking at it a little bit differently, but still kind of targeting a smaller unit type, which I do think is, kind of tying back to that bigger question about diversity of housing, or whether it's affordable or not. I think that the goal here is to generate or offer a way for a different type of housing product, which has maybe a different look and a different composition, which may reduce the price of that unit. Maybe not as much as we want it to be, but the idea here is that setting those mins and maximums will affect that overall price, and hopefully offer opportunities at a wider price point. Max impervious surface, we are proposing 70%, but I do like that happy medium where maybe it goes back to 60, which is consistent with maybe what the current R1 is, but maybe some opportunities to increase if using impervious surfaces. I think the courtyard, the common courtyard's really, the goal there is to provide a gathering space, and there are requirements for pedestrian connectivity, and those might be great opportunities in which you could see those pavers that would provide kind of a count as pervious surface, but still meet the intent. Be a good way to utilize that. For parking, the proposal is for one off-street parking space per dwelling unit, and one guest parking space for every 4 if there is no street parking. So the idea here is to not kind of over park the cottage cluster, right? If there is a public parking available along the street and the cottage is adjacent to that street, there is an expectation that there would be available parking, and they could walk along sidewalks and access the cottage cluster. And in that instance, they would not be required to do guest parking. Doesn't mean they couldn't do it if they wanted to, but they just wouldn't be required to.
I'd love to comment on that when it's time to, but
Oh, yeah, you can. Feel free. Parking is such a hot button item.
well, particularly here in Canby, and everybody knows that I feel really strongly about it. We are a bedroom community. The majority of people who live in Canby do not work in Canby. And even though we're looking at these cottage clusters as more affordable than single-family homes, they're still easily going to be $500,000. right? You're going to have families, right?
I don't think that
You don't-
figure is correct.
Okay.
I think we're probably looking at more in the 200,000 to 300,000 for a 1,200 square foot home. I mean, again, this is,
That's mind-blowing.
Yeah.
That's considerably less than any of the examples that we saw from stuff that was built in the mid-aughts. How are we going to do that?
well, I think part of, I mean, depending, well, and part of this is depending on like where the geography is. I mean, and I think that, I don't think they're $500,000. I don't think a 1,200 square foot home is $500,000. I mean, I think it's less than that.
Pushing, depending.
Okay. What are you finding, Hannah?
Well, we have, every
Turn on your mic.
Every neighborhood is different, every area is different, but as an example, a little over a year ago, for 1,400 square feet was appraised at 410,000.
And what was the lot size?
I can't remember to be exact, on the smaller side, under 0.2 for sure, acres. So I'd have to look at that up.
Okay.
But
I mean, I think part of this is, I mean, we can come back with more information on the target. I'm just, and maybe that's important to understand, but I think it's really hard to compare a small lot and a regular subdivision to what this product is.
Well, where I was going with it
Yeah,
is
yeah.
that you're going to need to have a pretty decent salary to afford them, even on the lower end of it.
Yeah, yeah.
Because I remember when friends were buying houses 15 years ago, that when they were making $80,000 a year, it was a reach to buy a house that was $250,000. So being a bedroom community and needing to have probably at least $100,000 of income on the low end of your estimates of what these cottages might cost, they should have at least 2 parking stalls required for each unit, by my estimation, because you're going to need more than one income in almost every situation. And when we're talking about guest parking and off-street parking, I'd like us to look at having a minimum width of parking, or excuse me, minimum width of street space, because when we're looking at some of the older neighborhoods, they have really narrow roads that currently might technically allow for parking on both sides, but when parking is on both sides of the street, only one lane of traffic can go through the road at any given time. And so if we're saying our current situation in approving guest parking is available on off-street, or excuse me, on-street parking is available for guests and potentially for inhabitants as well, we might be making that assumption on these really narrow 20-foot wide streets that really shouldn't have a lot of on-street parking, but technically do. And over time, we might have to be revisiting, can we allow that much on-street parking when it's creating traffic issues and safety issues for, getting around town and visibility and whatnot.
I think, I was thinking about the comment that you made, Commissioner Driscoll. We're looking at these, and there's nothing in this code that talks about skinny streets. These are complete streets. These are standard streets, standard cross-sections.
Just calling it out that
Yeah.
these are
No,
standard streets with a minimum.
Well, I'm not saying, I mean, standard streets accommodate parking on both sides and have, pedestrian bike amenities. That's what we're assuming here. It's just, these are complete, these are not narrow, substandard.
I guess I'm just
Yeah.
saying, do we want to assume that, can we safely assume that these are only going to be built in areas that have those fully developed streets? That is a requirement of any of this off-street parking being,
And we have not proposed any modification to our street standards. And I think, obviously, we're concerned with what Canby Fire is going to say as well, and they're going to see the sketches that we're going to provide as well as the next step here in this process. But I don't want this to be an image that we have small houses on small lots on small streets, because that's not where I think we're going.
yeah, my only concern would be that where it would be incorporating into existing roads, that has been considered. Because it's not all of our streets are narrow, but we do have a number
Yeah,
of them that
and these
are.
very well could be brand-new streets in brand-new areas
And
and
that
meet
would be
city
the ideal,
standards.
right?
I mean, and again, so that's, I mean, we weren't, when we came up with this, I mean, we would obviously probably need to reveal that if we actually, wanted to have that. But I agree that, two cars need to pass freely. I mean, the emergency access is important. I think the idea behind limiting the parking is it does reduce the price to a degree. At least that's the input we've received from DLCD on that piece of it. And the parking could be clustered. I guess it could be combined in areas as well. It's a starting point for discussion on our end, but I did want to dismiss the fact that these are substandard streets, because that's not what's proposed.
Well, and I apologize
Yeah.
if that's what it sounds like I'm saying. I'm not saying that all of our streets are substandard by
Yeah.
any means. My concern would just be if these were happening to go in to an area where perhaps that was a concern or a consideration, that maybe we had something explicitly stating that those streets would not be considered for the off-street.
No, I 100% agree. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, maybe we even put something to the effect of, it's a complete street or it's got the full frontage, like it's met the standards.
That's all I'm asking for, is just that to
Oftentimes
be
when you
laid
do
out.
when you do a development, you're required to upgrade the frontage to be consistent with what the code says. I would like to think that would happen here, but it's a good point. I think there's some opportunities to kind of tweak that language to make it clear that it be legitimate, useful street
Yeah,
parking.
and developers are always going to say, we want less parking because for them, that's more land.
Yeah.
Great, they make more money the more that they're building, but then it comes down to the livability of everybody who's here. And honestly, I think probably like 60% of people who live in Canby drive big trucks or huge SUVs on top of the number of vehicles that it would take for people to work and afford any house, but even the cottages. It just seems like one parking space is significantly underestimating the true use and need.
And I think to that point, what we were maybe trying to do, because I don't know if I say it there, but we do in the standards, the actual code, annotated code, there is no maximum parking proposed. We're not trying to restrict parking. We're just trying not to make it an automatic, because I think we could all probably say if it's a 600 square foot cottage, it may not need two parking stalls. So
Have you ever lived in an apartment? I mean,
Well,
how many people
I
ended
mean,
up
but
renting it?
I think there's some opportunity for a person who's purchasing that to realize it comes with one parking stall, and therefore they're making that decision to buy that product. So it's just, again, providing the optionality and not necessarily dictating that, this much of the site, which is already constricted and constrained with all the other pieces we're asking here in this kind of form to be to parking. And so it's just attempting to give that flexibility. I totally hear the concern, and I think that is a valid one. I've worked in a lot of communities that have this challenge, and I can definitely appreciate the issue it creates. And we all have been the people that get the complaint after the developer leaves, so I can understand wanting to avoid that.
I just know however many people who have lived in all of these neighborhoods that have built up over the last 20 years, and you cannot visit them because there's nowhere to park.
And I think-
like that, and then they themselves have difficulty finding a place to park for their own home. And people are only making so much choice. Like, if the only thing available to you is the 600-foot home with one parking space, yeah, someone's going to buy it. It's not like they're getting their dream home or a situation that's ideal or even functional, really, but that's what's available, and they're going to take what they can get because they need something. And so I just would like to offer people a better life experience of buying a home than you get one spot, enjoy your 600-foot home. To me, that seems kind of like a kick in the pants on a number of levels.
I think that, to your point, Commissioner Driscoll, we'll try to drill down on the dual income piece. That resonates. I think in terms of that, we'll try to nail the price point down on what these are. It's difficult because there's not a ton of them, like in the setting here that we're in. I think there's some in.
I remember early in the process that you
Silverton, I
guys,
think it was, yeah, Silver, I mean, that's a small, yeah. I mean, so we'll try to drill that down. I mean, to the extent, there is some support to some degree about the fact, again, we're trying to change the balance, the job housing balance here, so people are not driving away, thousands of people coming in, thousands of people leaving. More people leave and go to work in Portland than anything else. Second most is people coming in to work here, and third is people that live and work here. So that, we have some statistics on that. And so those are all important elements in this equation. But the model code, again, that we're starting with that and as a baseline to get your input.
Thanks.
Are we, any other parking comments?
Nope.
Awesome.
Okay, one last quick one.
Go
I'll
for
take
it.
2 seconds, just so we don't have any real public transit available. We have CAT, which is kind of a nice service. We're kind of around town, but you're not going to use that to get from Canby to a job anywhere other than in Canby.
You might be able to get to Oregon City and Wilsonville, but
Maybe if
you
you've
probably
got
can't
3
get to
hours,
Portland.
for transit.
Yeah.
It's not convenient and it's not reliable enough for people
Yeah.
to really like build their work schedules around it, because the kind of people who are
Yeah.
going to need it might have less flexible work schedules. And so just keeping in mind that it's a car or your feet or nothing. And yeah, thank you.
All right. Moving on to the cottage orientation. So there's a lot in both the model code and we've carried it forward here into the proposed code for Canby to really work on how cottages are oriented within the cluster, whether it be in the PUD or standalone. This is all kind of resonating and required. I don't know if I said that early on, but these are true whether it's standalone or PUD. So an expectation that 50% of the cottages would orient towards the common courtyard. The idea there is really to activate that space and make it kind of a community space. And so felt that orientation was a pivotal part of that. That cottages that could face the public street if they're within 20 feet. So in a second, graphic will show up, but the idea here is that, as your cottages are laid out, if there is that public street along the front and you've got a cottage within 20 feet, it has the ability to orient. It's not requiring it, it just gives that flexibility. And then to have pedestrian pathways in scenarios where cottages are either not oriented to the courtyard or not oriented to the public street, making sure they have clear connections to those community spaces, both internal to the site and those public spaces along the frontage. Here is just a little snip from the model code to kind of give some initial kind of illustration. As Dawn mentioned, we are going to be working on diagrams that are specific to the codes that we implement for Canby, but in the interest of being a little high level at this point, went with these more generic examples here to just have the conversation. So you can see here that several of the units are actually oriented to the courtyard, and then those kind of soft lines there represent the pedestrian connections. You don't have the cottages near the road there orienting to the front, but they are orienting to that courtyard. So again, creating kind of the concept of integrating that central feature of the courtyard or the cluster, excuse me. We do have specific standards for the courtyard. We talked earlier on about minimum square footage per unit, so that courtyard gets larger the more units you have in the cluster. I did not do the math, but somebody could probably do it and tell me that your maximum cluster size or minimum cluster size if you have, or courtyard size if you have a cluster of 12 units is somewhere around 1,800 square feet. It's rough math, don't quote me, but it does set that target. And then obviously as you grow your cottage development, if you have more than 12, then you'd see a smattering of these courtyards to support it. They are required for each cottage cluster. So cottage cluster is 4 or more. So we're required there. And they must be contiguous with cottages on at least 2 sides. So again, that idea is to activate and not make this kind of random spot in the corner of the site that's not usable act as the cottage cluster. That's not the intent. We do want them to be usable spaces. So the recommendation at this point is to have a minimum width of 15 feet at its narrowest point. So you could have a rectangle like what's shown on the screen, so long as that narrowest point is 15 feet wide. And we do want to see a mix of amenities in this space. So we do want to see landscaping, hardscape, or maybe those pervious pavers for the sidewalks, other amenities that the developer or the community might want to see there to support the community use of that space.
So by necessity, are fences prohibited because you don't actually own any specific land directly around your house? And and therefore you can't have dogs in these?
Good question. We did not specifically discuss fences or propose anything with fences here. I think there is a scenario in which the cottage cluster is on a single lot of record, right? And so I think maybe the HOA or the underlying ownership would have something to say about the fencing, but we didn't specifically kind of prescribe that.
Yeah, it was just a
here.
random thought as I was looking at this.
Well,
I'm
and
just
I
like,
think there's
Dog run.
There's a couple scenarios. Jessica's mentioning the common ownership, and which is more like a condominium, but it's a special kind of condominium, like cottage cluster. That's the distinction.
yeah.
Slightly different in that you would still have the underlying ownership of the house and your yard, but the part in common would be the other common areas. There also could be a land division as well, and that's a really good question. We can come back with that information.
Yeah, I don't expect you to have answers. It was just something that
it's a
crossed my
great
mind.
question. I would presume that people, if they have individual lots and it was subdivided, might want fences, but part of this is, I think we need to come back with some more design elements because it might look really weird too, but it's like that might very well be the case where if it's divided and you have fee ownership, because you've divided it out versus in common, more of a condominium scenario. Those may result in different looks. I think the one in Silverton was all open, as I recall.
Aesthetically, it's more pleasing.
Yeah,
And that might be a decision point for people.
Yeah.
If you can't have a fenced-in area, perhaps this isn't, for you if you have dogs that need to run around, but.
And we need to kind of figure that out more and get some input on that.
And that would go to the larger fence discussion we are due.
Yeah, Ryan is still here.
Have we hit a hot button?
No. Yeah, you will be hearing about fences next year too. sometime.
Man, I'm so excited. Can't wait. I missed Mr. Potter's presentation so much. They were awesome.
All right, moving on, next set. We do have some criteria in the code regarding community buildings. We're not requiring them, but we do want to offer the opportunity for them. I've actually seen a couple of scenarios in which they're like covered outdoor spaces, almost like, like an outdoor kitchen, so you could have your kid's birthday party in the center commons. And so providing an opportunity for that, we are setting it as a maximum of 1 per cluster. That seems pretty reasonable, but open to suggestions or discussion on that. And then we set a target, a maximum of 1,400 square feet of floor area. We do, at this point, think community buildings would and should count towards the required minimum common courtyard square footage, assuming they're in the common courtyard. So you could offer up that covered structure as an amenity within that overall space, but definitely open to.
Well, if 1,800 square foot is kind of the maximum of any of them.
Well, it's just the minimum required. If you had 12, you could do more.
So you could have a larger community space than 12.
You could,
I thought we
yes.
had to get new ones after.
Well, you would, so the way the code is written, at least the way I kind of interpret or anticipated it would be applied, is if you have a 12 unit or a 12 cottage cluster, you have a minimum requirement of, I hope 1,800 square feet is right, because now we're using it, so I hope my internal math is right. But, so that's the minimum target. Nothing says you couldn't have more in that one courtyard, but if you have, a 24 cottage development, you would need 2 courtyards, and they would need to be at least 1,800 square feet because they're serving 12 cottages apiece. Does that make sense?
Sort of. So if there were 16 cottage units in the cluster, we would just add an extra 600 feet to the 1,800 feet and
No, I think you'd have to have a second courtyard that's 600 square feet to meet those 4 additional cottages. I
Okay.
think that math tracked.
Well, then I still think that, tell me if I'm just totally off. I'm not 100% here today, people. But yeah, so it sounds like if at 12 as a threshold, you have to then add something else on separately that in some situations, we would have a community building that could take up 1,400 of
the
1,800.
That's fair. That's, yes, I think there's a scenario in which that would be true.
Okay.
I would say there's, excuse me, there's nothing that prevents a developer from providing more open space than is required. But that's a very good point, because if we do have a cottage cluster that says you have to have that 1,800 square feet and they want to put that community building, you know, you're only
Then you
left
just got a
with
big building in the
400.
middle of it and
Yeah,
nobody
you're
really
left with
has
400 square feet of open space. And I guess the question back to the commission tonight would be, is there a preference for what that courtyard, you know, form really takes? Is that community building, excuse me, excuse me, community building equal to, you know, green grass?
Well, it'll be an issue with the impervious or pervious,
Excuse me.
you know, land or whatever that they have to deal with. But I don't mean to sound like I'm being difficult about all this. I'm just,
No, these
I'm
are-
looking at it through
these are-
the lens of,
It's
I'm a
great.
developer and I'm going to do things to maximize my profit or to do things in a certain prescriptive way. I think that a community building, even one at 1,400 square feet, that's like mostly open or maybe closed because sometimes the weather's crummy, like all of that actually sounds nice. So I don't want to sound like I'm, you know, not liking any of this. My concern would be if we're trying to build open green spaces, both from a visual perspective and also from like a functional, this is my house isn't very big, but I've got some outdoor space that I can enjoy. And then they all were using almost the entirety of the required land space for buildings. Would that be meeting the spirit of what we're hoping to see in terms of the development with the cottage clusters?
I think maybe a good option there would be to consider the community building as more of like a proportion of, a percentage of the required, like it can be a maximum of 40% of the required open space. Maybe that's a good way to create flexibility in what form that common courtyard
'cause I
takes,
wouldn't
but
want-
also preserves the idea
space.
that really there is, you are losing your private open space on your yard, on your site, so you should see it in the common courtyard.
And would I be correct in that we're not trying to litigate every aspect of cottage clusters tonight, right? I mean, there's going to be time for.
Yeah,
for
no, this is good, but I think Commissioner Driscoll's asking some really good questions. that will
100%.
help us to come back with examples to articulate this better in terms of a code so that unintended consequences are not, you know, like, so the purpose is there. And I think one of those things that got brought up also, I'd like to come back with examples, Jessica, on scale as well. Like, I think this is important to understand what the sizes of the examples that we have on scale as well, because that seemed to be a pretty large question as well. Like, you know,
But to your point, we're talking high level at this point, concept.
We are,
We're
yeah.
going to dive into specifics of cottage clusters and debate all the different intricacies of their uniqueness down at the next stage, and then make recommendations to council. Am I correct?
that's correct. And I'm visualizing, you know, Planning Commission, February 12th, I think is what I said. And there probably will be either a session with council or a joint session
Right.
with Planning Commission and council. And then we'll launch into the Planning Commission hearings, and then council hearing or hearings.
So we'll have plenty of examples to see, debate, look at.
Yeah, and there's a lot that
In
we've
conjunction.
thrown at you tonight, and apologies if we're making this feel like it's like, you know, putting a lot of pressure on you guys, but trying to set the table here for like what we're trying to achieve, and also some of the parameters around the processes that we're trying to deal with here.
Yeah.
So if there are other high-level items that you all want us to bring back, that would be really helpful for us to understand. So concerns, et cetera, like, what do you want us, what have we not said that we would bring back that you'd like us to bring back at the February 12th discussion?
Well, it sounds like we have a debate over the price, because I remember the
Yeah.
examples listed early in the process, and they were up to $1 million. I remember some of the examples given. So I don't know if they're, what part of the country they were in, what part of the state.
And I'm hoping that perhaps even some of the folks that were interested in doing these developments could give me what that might be for Canby, because I think it's quite unique as to what you're building where, and like, you know, the geography does make a difference. I mean, as to where that is, yeah.
The expensive one that we saw was in White Salmon, I remember, but yeah.
Yeah, that's a really nice area.
Yeah, I know, I remember that.
Yeah, I mean,
I loved it when we saw the examples.
Yeah.
That was so awesome, and I agree, the more we see of that as we get down the road.
I mean, I think they'll be nice here too, Judy, but I think to the extent, those may have had views of the river. I'm not sure, you know, or
Oh,
like,
no, I know, they were amazing.
I mean, so those are not the same if you
No,
have
I
a
agree.
river view.
I
I mean,
totally
like,
agree.
yeah, I mean, so.
Commissioner Hutchinson had something.
I think that one thing that kind of took people by surprise maybe, and I saw further discussion of it in the packet, has to do with if you put a planned unit development in an R1 zone, then that means that you are accepting every form of housing that you allow into that planned unit zone through another pathway into that same R1 zone. And I think that it kind of opened up a discussion for when people started seeing townhouses in R1, it kind of grabbed them in an odd way. And so, I mean, it may be something that we need to look at if we want to do this, you know, I mean, either with a special zone and maybe not, or maybe just have it be with a 1, 5, and 2 residential zones and leave one out of it, or we just need to have an honest discussion about increasing density in R1 and look at, you know, more straight ahead ways of doing it first, as opposed to, you know, I mean, in a way, this kind of comes across that the way that we're looking at it as sort of a backdoor way to change housing types in R1. And I know that this is something that we need to do, but maybe this isn't the best way to broach that subject. Just thinking out loud about that.
And to your great points, and even within the confines of what a PUD would be, since that's a particularly type of development. I mean, because the base zone's not changing in terms of what would be allowed, but I mean, what would make that more transparent or more acceptable? I guess that would be what we would want to know. I mean, we were talking about transitionary. I mean, part of it is, you know, the concept of having townhomes intermixed with single-family homes that are all very well done in a community setting, like a PUD, happens a lot, and I think it works pretty well. May not be very common in Canby, but yeah.
And on its face, it doesn't bother me at all, really. But I think that maybe it would be best discussing that as a separate subject rather than in terms of a PUD. You know what I'm saying? Is because it, you know, maybe then that way we can get some of the more base discussions about that kind of mixed housing type. You know, because it seems like you were saying, it's like the planned use development thing is something that we really don't have space for now, but we have space for, you know, the straight ahead role of using those same housing types somewhere else. And if this is the way we're going to do it, I mean, it seems like one way, but I think that if we're just going to start allowing, you know, townhomes, it would be best if we just straight ahead and did that straight up with the code and did it with the regular zone as opposed to doing it through the PUD.
Would there be more, I mean, because it's already recognized in the R15 zone, I mean, would that be?
You know, I'm just kind of thinking about why, you know, some of the ruffled feathers may have come from that, because
Okay.
I think it's an aspect of the conversation that I don't think people were ready for.
Well, and there's a lot you guys were given tonight. I mean, we've had, even at our level where we're dealing with this every day, it's a lot. There's a lot changing. Our world is changing, and a lot of things are changing, and part of that is recognizing that, you know, we're in that mix, and how do we collectively come to a solution that works for this community? I mean, that's within those confines, and So I think if we could come back with some thoughts on that.
I guess
Yeah.
maybe a good way to look at it is like, I'm most in favor of codified. I mean, even though I am a commissioner, it's like, I really like it when things are clear, and then it doesn't have to come to us unless we're expanding, the city limits or changing a zone from one thing to another, then of course, but, I agree that, that there should be a less deliberative process for a lot of these things, and it seems like that the law is just pushing us that way. I mean, whether you're talking about from the federal level like we did with Agit Pi and the new 5G, and that there were a lot of decisions there that were taken out of our hands, but at least we could kind of guide the ship into port, the way that we wanted it to be pointed, as opposed to having something completely,
So maybe starting more generically with where could that be more, under what circumstance would that work that would be more?
Because I think that we would
favorable,
see that first.
Okay.
Because I think before that we would see townhomes in R1, and before we would see townhomes in a PUD, we would see it using our approval of having it in a PUD as a reason to have it in R1. And then people might say, hey, I didn't realize this is what we were talking about. Even though in the packet you state over and over again, and it's because of state law that there has to be a codified process to lead the way, and then the deliberative one can trot alongside if we so choose to do it that way. And so, I like coming at it that way first, even though it makes the conversation less comfortable and maybe more oppositional, just because some people will NIMBY you to the wall.
Just make it outright without a PUD, or do you?
I mean, it all follows. I mean, I like the discussion of the PUD, but I think the PUD drags along with it some larger issues that might be better addressed first.
Gotcha, okay. And would examples be helpful in that context?
Yes,
Okay.
yes, I think
so.
so.
I think maybe, I think that would be, okay. And then I think teasing that out would be like, part of this is like, not to get too creative here, but there could be like layers of between R1 and R15 of what is allowed between those two. Again, I'm just trying to, we'll spend some time on that. Okay.
And not to belabor the point, but I think we have 3 more slides. Is there a bunch more content to
We're
go?
so close.
Okay, I just want to make sure that we're not cutting you off.
We'll power through.
All right.
Pedestrian access. I don't think anyone's going to have any heartburn over this. The goal here is to really create a connection between buildings within the site and also any shared parking areas or other amenities, and then also tie into abutting public sidewalks. So consistent with the model code, and let's just get planning, right? Existing structures, we did bring in language here to make sure that if you have a site with an existing single-family home, that site is, or that structure itself is recognized as not needing to hit those max and min square footage requirements, that it can be retained on the site. No one really wants to see a good, useful housing unit go away. So providing opportunities for that to retain as part of the cottage cluster should they look to redevelop the site. And then parking area standards, everyone's favorite. So in instances where we are looking to, regardless of, I guess, number of parking stalls, the idea here is to provide different ways in which parking can be met. So you can see off to the left of the cottage example here, you've got that clustered parking that Don was talking about. You can see here that showing 5 stalls and then a nice landscape buffer and then 5 more stalls. We thought that made good sense. It's kind of similar to what you would see in commercial development, requiring those landscape strips in between to just break up that parking a little bit. So we are proposing at this point, if they are clustered, that you have that max of 5 stalls before you get that break. Clustered parking can be covered. It's not required, but can be. Nice little examples here. The red box to the right side is a scenario in which you have that covered carport parking as an alternative, or you may even have an attached or detached garage. And then you can see there that it's got a separate driveway to kind of serve that particular form of parking. So definitely optionality here, which I think would, the ways in which that builds out on the site would have a lot to do with how you access it from the front of, from those existing public roadways. If you have maximums for driveway spacing and things like that, you may see different ways in which this really builds out, but providing that flexibility. Any questions? We do have requirements for setting back those parking areas. So you can see in this example that we've got that parking, clustered parking 20 feet from that street and 10 feet from the side yard. And then there is a nice little bubbled area representing some screening to screen against or screen that parking from the public street. Thought I had a little circle around it, but I don't. We also included in our recommendations some requirements to screen those parking areas in the event they're up against or can be visible from residential areas. That is something above and beyond the model code that we understood to be a pretty important compatibility feature when bringing in these cottage clusters into existing neighborhoods in Canby. So thought that could be a good opportunity, coupled with those setbacks, to really buffer against any sort of negative effect of that clustered parking. Really feels like the clustered parking is probably the most efficient way to park a cottage, and want to make sure that we're proposing design standards that help that integrate properly.
When we talk about screening, is there a minimum height for
I
screening?
believe there is 3 feet is my,
I think you're correct.
is three
Yeah,
feet?
yeah.
Yes, I believe so. How do you feel about 3 feet?
Well, I'm just thinking for people who are in R1 or R1.5 and are having this put in, they're going to be in a home that's probably, 25 to 30 some odd feet tall. They're going to look out their window and they're going to see a big parking lot no matter what you do. Screening it from the street is aesthetically nice just for going through the neighborhood. I don't have any problem with that. I just don't know that it would be enthusiastically received by the surrounding area. That's where some of the development of putting things together as an overall PUD might be beneficial, because it can kind of be balanced and screened by other homes that are all new again, as opposed to the existing structure.
So do you kind of envision in this scenario, let's say the development to the left side of the screen, kind of opposite that C area, which is that 10-foot buffer or setback, do you kind of envision that to be like a robust vegetative buffer that has...
In an ideal situation, I think that would be
Got it.
really nice, just to have something that's going to grow taller, maybe, trees that'll get 30 feet tall in the end, like maybe
Okay.
it requires a certain, stretch of land that you're going to put some bigger hardy trees that can grow up and just kind of like make it a more green area. It'd be nicer for the people who are actually living in the cottages that maybe, if their house, all the back windows look out to the parking lot, at least
Right.
when they look beyond that, they're not just looking into somebody else's window, they can at least see some trees or something.
So maybe in kind of that limited context, it's where it abuts an existing kind of low-density residential,
It might-
not necessarily visible from anyone, like across the street diagonal. That's not really the intent. It's really where they directly abut.
Yeah, and that might just be asking for too much. I know we don't want to put like too many, restrictions on people, but I think that would be nice in an ideal world. My only other minor concern is these are showing, it looks like 10-foot entrances into the parking lots and potentially to the carports and stuff. And then there's an alley behind it. My only other concern would just make sure that those are actually wide enough for fire trucks to get to everything that they need to, because obviously they could get to the homes in the front pretty easily from the street itself, but stuff in the back, where there's an alley, if they're going to have to if the fire access is going to have to be through the new parking structure on the left-hand side, that's going to need to be a wider entrance to be able to get in and get to the houses in the back.
Great points. I will say most of this is pretty illustrative, right? The
Sure.
points that are truly graphically represented and I think intended to be kind of illustrated by this are the couple of points that are circled. Nothing about this code is meant to preclude actual function.
Sure. Yeah.
But great
Sorry
points.
if I go down that.
No, it's great points. And I will say we stole this from the model code as well, again, for this conversation, but this is great feedback because as we bring forward diagrams for your consideration, it's good to know that those peripheral kind of considerations are important here. So it's helpful.
There were a number of references to preferring to have the parking come off an alley. Is that inaccurate?
I do think there is some discussion about that in the model code. We didn't specifically require that because we don't think alleys are always going to be there, right? So
There or beneficial. It was just-
yes,
It didn't
yeah.
make a lot of sense to me.
So we didn't find that was necessarily kind of critical to opening the door for these development scenarios in Canby. So the alley is referenced here. There are discussions about how alleys may be used, but there's no requirement at this point.
Okay. Yeah, okay. You know better than I from having just read through it once ago. Great.
That's it. And we don't really need this discussion slide. We've had a really good conversation today. I really appreciate everybody's feedback this evening. As Don shared, it's definitely been a process. There was a lot of code to go over, and I appreciate everyone's candor.
So I was actually able to pull
I'm
up.
so sorry.
Yeah.
Go back.
Oh, no, you're fine. I was actually able to pull up really quick via the RMLS, which is the regional multiple listing service. There is just on 3rd here in downtown Canby, 896 square feet, acres. They normally do like 0.11 or something. They don't even list it because it's this really small lot. And they have it listed for $375, and that's 2 bedrooms and 2 bathrooms. And they've got 4 of them. They have them stacked. You have front and back, and then right next door, front and back. And they've been on the market for just under 2 weeks, so who knows what they'll actually end up going for, but that's just what's happening now.
Just curious, I know there's no parking downtown, but do they have parking?
Yeah, they do. They did, how they structured it is they have a garage on the bottom and then a kind of a balcony for the primary bedroom up top. And then I can't see what they've done for the back. The
But they
backside
have at least a
unit.
garage, though.
Yeah.
Okay,
And a
that's helpful.
decent sized driveway.
And we'll try to get some other comparables. I mean, and like what the target maybe is, even for people that might be interested in doing this. So it's,
And Dawn or Jessica, I'm not sure which one this would be more appropriate to, but perhaps Villebois in Wilsonville, having a complete site map. I was just able to get on their website and they have a PDF color coded with a legend on there, and it really gives a lot of detail specific to what we were talking about. And you can kind of see that the single family is on the periphery, and as you get closer and closer, you can see the multi-level
builds up.
dwellings or townhome dwellings, 3-level townhome, that type of thing. So kind of consistent with what we were talking about earlier, if that helps. Villebois in Wilsonville, good site map.
Thank you.
gotcha. And that was probably a PUD, I'm guessing, of some sort that they went through that process.
I've heard they have a pretty robust HOA, and it's massive. The property is just ridiculous. It is a lot of acres.
And I think that, before you mentioned that, we'll come back with some other examples. I think we're trying to match that up with, more of this issue about how does this work in terms of transitionary things, and some of that will work better than others. I also would like to spend some time offline with David on clear and objective standards, and also with some of the potential folks that might be interested in developing what their size of their developments might be. And I'm not really sure what the parameters that we can use or not use, but we'll try to bring back some information on that as well. So I think it's more quantifiable.
And for what it's worth, I kind of echo Commissioner Hutchinson. I think KISS method, keep it simple, stupid. I think the simpler, the less discretion, the more the process is protected. And I'm not necessarily afraid of all the, things we've heard about per se, but I certainly don't want to walk right into a trap and tee ourselves up either for a big fight with LUBA or anything like that. Not that, LUBA is this big ambiguous, like a boogeyman to me. I don't even know if I should be scared of LUBA, but I'm told that it can be expensive for the city to get into a pissing contest with them. So I don't think we want to walk ourselves into that. I think underwriting it to the extent that we take the guesswork out would be a benefit for all of us, whatever that looks like.
We thank you for your patience walking through this. We knew this was going to be a lot, and I appreciate your willingness to continue the journey here with us on this. We'll provide more information coming back. So we're ready to, talk about other things, including the minutes, and if Commissioner Ewart's still on. Okay.
He departed.
Did we lose Dan, Commissioner
Yes.
Ewart? We did? Okay.
So I'm going to keep it
I
simple.
think he's in Hawaii.
What's that?
Isn't he in Hawaii?
I'm not sure where he's at. Yeah.
He's out of the state.
Fighting fires.
Fighting fires, yeah.
Yeah,
He's
literally.
saving people.
If I could jump into a few updates, just real quickly. I mentioned December 11th will be our last Planning Commission work session, last meeting for the year, and we'll talk about the housing needs analysis, going through that, and then that will be sent to you on December 1st. Which is a revised housing needs analysis, and that'll be a fruitful discussion, kind of fits into what we talked about tonight on efficiency measures. Wanted to thank all those that participated in the November 14th Community Summit. Very well attended, more so than we ever thought would be in terms of that building. It was pretty much overflow capacity building. We're going to be looking for another venue for that next summit that will be a repeat of that same summit, and looking to hopefully target that in January. And so we're looking for another larger facility with good parking and accessibility for that.
School cafeteria has a sound system.
Which high school? Okay, cafeteria, okay.
And I sent an email to Jamie, but that Foursquare Church on 99 has a auxiliary building that's huge, that half of it is just completely open, and half of it has a lot of movable seating, and they have tons of parking. I've been there for ODOT meetings in the past.
Okay, that's great, and thank you both. But yeah, we obviously need a bigger venue, and part of that was the notice out to those in the study area for the urban growth boundary, and that's received a lot of attention, which was good. I mean, in terms of you sent something out, and we want those people, we want everybody to be participating, but we want those that are, in that study area to continue to participate. Like looking forward, I won't go into all the details, but we have a couple land use hearings coming up in January for both January 8th and 22nd. And as I mentioned, housing efficiency measures targeting February 12th to come back with all the information again in another work session. And then housing needs analysis hearing with the Planning Commission targeting February 26th, and that would go to council on March 20th. So that's what I've got for our portion of this. I wanted to thank David and Kelly for participating tonight with us on this as we work through these items, and that was all I had.
All right. Thank you, David and Kelly, and thank you, Jessica.
Thank you.
Very helpful. I also thought that last event that we attended, that was so cool, particularly being not just a citizen, but being on the Planning Commission. You really got a sense for what the community is saying. There was farmers there, there was, single people, there were married people with kids, there was like kind of a nice crosshatch of our community all there, and all of them had very interesting thoughts on how you're going to make this all work as we grow, but it certainly gave it gave, at least from a planning commission perspective, a sense of what's really important and what the community as a whole cared about. It was really cool to see that visual on everybody's map, and they were all very, very close. The results seemed very, very similar in the ultimate outcome, so that was pretty cool.
Yeah, and I think it's pretty exciting. I mean, I think people, I was just very impressed with how positive people stayed, given the uncomfortable circumstances that we were trying to handle while literally on the fly. And appreciate the people that went into the hallway and did their table groups. We got it to work, but it was like 6:15, and there were still like 20 people coming into the building. We were supposed to start at 6, and it was like already standing room. So yeah, it was probably one of the biggest crowds I've ever seen in one of those events. So
Yeah, super cool.
Yeah. So more to come. We'll keep you all posted. I'll have more to share on December 11th for hopefully we'll have some of those target dates nailed down for when that next summit's going to be and where it's going to be on that. So thank you again. You great input tonight. That's it.
Commissioner DeRoche, I just want to make sure you're not getting ignored. You've been really quiet. Did you have anything before?
All right, thank you. I appreciate, Don, the way everybody put things together tonight. I did go over all the information in great detail and the way you summarized it and then highlighted all the changes. Thank you, thank you, thank you. You guys did a great job with that. And yes, it's a lot, but anyway. Hey, my palm tree light went off. That's time for bed. It's later here, by the way. Anyway, it doesn't matter.
Fair enough.
That's my sign.
Well, with
Anyway,
that,
I have a quick question. So, administrative, so as we're getting near the end of the year and some terms on the commission are expiring, and last year, you may recall, there was a very lively discussion because Canby made a change that when a person's term expires, they have to reapply, and those positions, the city would advertise that they were open on the commissions and boards. So where are we at with the ones that are expiring next month?
Great question. I was not prepared to answer that.
Oh, sorry.
you just reminded me, Judy,
Yeah.
that I forgot to respond to the individual that reached out to me about 3 weeks ago.
Well, it changed last year. I don't remember if you were part, but there was a very lively discussion because nobody liked it. But I'm just curious, is the city still doing that? Or I haven't seen them advertise, so I don't know.
Judy, thank you for that. I need to do a refresh. There's been so much, to be honest with you, going on
Oh, yeah,
many
a little.
fronts. I thought that was not even on my radar. I'm just going to be honest. But yes, I agree. I've seen the good, the bad, and everything else between on these discussions. So
My term expires in December, and they reached out to me, the city reached out to me maybe in September and said, are you interested in continuing? And if so, send us the application again, and I did. And I hadn't heard anything back, and I was going to say,
Okay.
hey.
well, and let me make some context. I think Maya or CJ is handling that. I'm not sure, but I will.
CJ. I think it was
CJ.
And when they
Okay.
started doing that, though, the city committed, because the city's purpose was to open those roles so that more people would know that they were open.
Gotcha.
And I don't know, most of us said, what? But that doesn't seem to be happening anyway.
I will look into it. Thank you for the notice.
Okay, thanks.
I totally
That's it
forgot.
for me, thank you.
Okay.
I need to call or email CJ.
What was that? Okay.
Okay,
Move we close.
do we have a second?
I second.
All in favor?
Aye.
Aye. We're out of here. Good night, Canby.
Bye.